Chapter 13, Part 3, of Pagan and Christian Creeds, Their Origin and Meaning. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Pagan and Christian Creeds, Their Origin and Meaning, by Edward Carpenter. The Genesis of Christianity, Part 3. There are many other difficulties. The raising of Lazarus, already dead 3 days. The turning of water into wine, a miracle attributed to Bacchus of old, the feeding of the 5,000, and others of the marvels are, to say the least, not easy of digestion. The Sermon on the Mount, which, with the Lord's Prayer embedded in it, forms the great and accepted repository of Christian teaching and piety, is well known to be a collection of sayings from pre-Christian writings, including the Psalms, Isaiah, Ecclesiasticus, the Secrets of Enoch, the Shemona Hezra, a book of Hebrew prayers, and others, and the fact that this collection was really made after the time of Jesus and could not have originated from him is clear from the stress which it lays on persecutions and false prophets, things which were certainly not a source of trouble at the time Jesus is supposed to be speaking, though they were at a later time, as well as from the occurrence of the word Gentiles, which, being here used apparently in contradistinction to Christians, could not well be appropriate at a time when no recognized Christian bodies as yet existed. But the most remarkable point in this connection is the absolute silence of the Gospel of Mark on the subject of the resurrection and ascension, that is, of the original Gospel, for it is now allowed on all hands that the 12 verses, Mark 16:9 to the end, are a later insertion. Considering the nature of this event, astounding indeed if physically true, and unique in the history of the world, it is strange that this Gospel, the earliest written of the 4 Gospels and nearest in time to the actual evidence, makes no mention of it. The next Gospel in point of time, that of Matthew, mentions the matter rather briefly and timidly and reports the story that the body had been stolen from the sepulchre. Luke enlarges considerably and gives a whole long chapter to the resurrection and ascension, while the 4th Gospel, written fully 20 years later still, say about AD 120, gives 2 chapters and a great variety of details. This increase of detail, however, as one gets farther and farther from the actual event, is just what one always finds, as I've said before, in legendary traditions. A very interesting example of this has lately come to light in the case of the traditions concerning the life and death of the Persian Bab. The Bab, as most of my readers will know, was the founder of a great religious movement which now numbers, or numbered before the Great War, some millions of adherents, chiefly Mohammedans, Christians, Jews, and Parsis. The period of his missionary activity was from 1845 to 1850. His gospel was singularly like that of Jesus, a gospel of love to mankind, only, as might be expected from the difference of date, with an even wider and more deliberate inclusion of all classes, creeds, and races, sinners and saints. And the incidents and entourage of his ministry were also singularly similar. He was born at Shiraz in 1820, and growing up a promising boy and youth, fell at the age of 21 under the influence of a certain Sayyid Kazim, leader of a heterodox sect, and a kind of forerunner, or John the Baptist, to the Bab. The result was a period of mental trouble, like the temptation in the wilderness, after which the youth returned to Shiraz, and at the age of 25 began his own mission. His real name was Mirza Ali Muhammad, but he called himself henceforth the Bab, that is, the Gate, I am the Way. And gradually there gathered around him disciples drawn by the fascination of his personality and the devotion of his character. But with the rapid increase of his following, great jealousy and hatred were excited among the mullahs, the upholders of a fanatical and narrow-minded Mohammedanism, and quite corresponding to the scribes and Pharisees of the New Testament. By them he was denounced to the Turkish government. He was arrested on a charge of causing political disturbance and was condemned to death. Among his disciples was one favorite, Mirza Muhammad Ali, one should note the similarity of the 2 names, who was absolutely devoted to his master and refused to leave him at the last. So together they were suspended over the city wall at Tabriz and simultaneously shot. This was on the 8th of July, 1850. In November 1850, or between that date and October 1851, a book appeared, written by one of the Bab's earliest and most enthusiastic disciples, a merchant of Kashan, and giving in quite simple and unpretending form a record of the above events. There is in it no account of miracles or of great pretensions to godhood and the like. It's just a plain history of the life and death of a beloved teacher. It was cordially received and circulated far and wide, and we have no reason for doubting its essential veracity. And even if proved now to be inaccurate in one or two details, this would not invalidate the moral of the rest of the story, which is as follows. After the death of the Bab, a great persecution took place in 1852. There were many Babi martyrs, and for some years the general followers were scattered, but in time they gathered themselves together again. Successors to the original prophet were appointed, though not without dissensions, and a Babi church, chiefly at Akka or Acre in Syria, began to be formed. It was during this period that a great number of legends grew up, legends of miraculous babyhood and boyhood, legends of miracles performed by the mature Bab, and so forth. And when the newly forming church came to look into the matter, it concluded, quite naturally, that such a simple history as I have outlined above would never do for the foundation of its plans, now grown somewhat ambitious. So a new gospel was framed, called the Tariq-i-Jihad, the new history, or the new way, embodying and including a lot of legendary matter, and issued with the authority of the church. This was in 1881-2, and comparing this with the original record, called the Point of Calf, we get a luminous view of the growth of fable in those 30 brief years which had elapsed since the Bab's death. Meanwhile, it became very necessary, of course, to withdraw from circulation as far as possible all copies of the original record, lest they should give the lie to the later gospel, and this apparently was done very effectively, so effectively indeed that Professor Edward Brown, to whom the world owes so much on account of his labors in connection with Babism, after arduous search came at one time to the conclusion that the original was no longer extant. Most fortunately, however, the well-known Comte de Gobineau had, in the course of his studies on Eastern religions, acquired a copy of the Point of Calf, and this after his death was found among his literary treasures and identified, as was most fitting, by Professor Brown himself. Such, in brief, is the history of the early Babi Church, a church which has grown up and expanded greatly within the memory of many yet living. Much might be written about it, but the chief point at present is for us to note the well-verified and interesting example it gives of the rapid growth in Syria of a religious legend, and the reasons which contributed to this growth, and to be warned how much more rapidly similar legends probably grew up in the same land in the middle of the 1st century A.D. The story of the Bab is also interesting to us because while this mass of legend was formed around it, there's no possible doubt about the actual existence of a historical nucleus in the person of Mirza Ali Muhammad. On the whole, one is sometimes inclined to doubt whether any great movement ever makes itself felt in the world without dating first from some powerful personality or group of personalities, round which the idealizing and myth-making genius of mankind tends to crystallize. But one must not even here be too certain. Something of the Apostle Paul we know, and something of John the Evangelist and writer of the Epistle 1, John, and that the Christian doctrines dated largely from the preaching and teaching of these two we cannot doubt. But Paul never saw Jesus except in the Spirit, nor does he ever mention the man personally, nor any incident of his actual life, the crucified Christ being always an ideal figure. And John, who wrote the Gospel, was certainly not the same as the disciple who lay in Jesus' bosom, though an intercalcated verse, the last but one in the Gospel, asserts the identity. Footnote. It is obvious, in fact, that the whole of the last chapter of St. John is a later insertion, and again that the 2 last verses of that chapter are later than the chapter itself. End of footnote. There may have been a historic Jesus, and if so, to get a reliable outline of his life would indeed be a treasure, but at present it would seem there is no sign of that. If the historicity of Jesus in any degree could be proved, it would give us reason for supposing, what I've always personally been inclined to believe, that there was also a personal nucleus for such personages as Osiris, Mithra, Krishna, Hercules, Apollo, and the rest. The question, in fact, narrows itself down to this. Have there been in the course of human evolution certain, so to speak, nodal points or periods at which the psychologic currents ran together and condensed themselves for a new start, And has each such node or point of condensation been marked by the appearance of an actual and heroic man or woman who supplied a necessary impetus for the new departure and gave his name to the resulting movement? Or is it sufficient to suppose the automatic formation of such nodes or starting points without the intervention of any special hero or genius, and to imagine that in each case the myth-making tendency of mankind created a legendary and inspiring figure and worshipped the same for a long period afterwards as a god? As I've said before, this is a question which, interesting as it is not really very important, the main thing being that the prophetic and creative spirit of mankind has from time to time evolved those figures as idealizations of its heart's desire, and placed a halo round their heads. The long procession of them becomes a real piece of history, the history of the evolution of the human heart and of human consciousness. But with the psychology of the whole subject I shall deal in the next chapter. I may here, however, dwell for a moment on two other points which belong properly to this chapter. I've already mentioned the great reliance placed by the advocates of a unique revelation on the high morality taught in the Gospels and the New Testament generally. There is no need, of course, to challenge that morality or to depreciate it unduly, but the argument assumes that it is so greatly superior to anything of the kind that had been taught before, that we're compelled to suppose something like a revelation to explain its appearance, whereas of course anyone familiar with the writings of antiquity among the Greeks or Romans, or Egyptians or Hindus, or later Druze, knows perfectly well that the reported sayings of Jesus and the apostles may be paralleled abundantly from these sources. I've illustrated this already from the Sermon on the Mount. If anyone will glance at the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, a Jewish book composed about 120 BC, he will see that it is full of moral precepts, and especially precepts of love and forgiveness, so ardent and so noble that it hardly suffers in any way when compared with the New Testament teaching, and that consequently no special miracle is required to explain the appearance of the latter. The 12 patriarchs in question are the 12 sons of Jacob, and the book consists of their supposed deathbed scenes in which each patriarch in turn recites his own more or less imaginary life and deeds and gives pious counsel to his children and successors. It is composed in a fine and poetic style and is full of lofty thought, remindful in scores of passages about the Gospels, words and all, the coincidences being too striking to be accidental. It evidently had a deep influence on the authors of the Gospels as well as on St. Paul. It affirms a belief in the coming of a Messiah and in the salvation for the Gentiles. The following are some quotations from it, the references being to the edition by R. H. Charles, 1907. Testament of Zebulun, page 116, quote, "My children, I bid you keep the commands of the Lord and show mercy to your neighbors, and have compassion towards all, not towards men only, but also towards beasts." End quote. Dan, page 127. Quote, "Love the Lord through all your life, and one another with a true heart." End quote. Joseph, page 173. Quote, "I was sick, and the Lord visited me, in prison, and my God showed favor unto me." End quote. Benjamin, page 209. Quote, "For as the sun is not defiled by shining on dung and mire, but rather drieth up both and driveth away the evil smell, so also the pure mind, encompassed by the defilements of earth, rather cleanseth them, and is not itself defiled." End quote. I think these quotations are sufficient to prove the high standard of this book, which was written in the 2nd century before Christ, and from which the New Testament authors copiously borrowed. The other point has to do with my statement at the beginning of this chapter that two of the main characteristics of Christianity were its insistence on a tendency towards renunciation of the world and a consequent cultivation of a purely spiritual love, and b, on a morality whose inspiration was a private sense of duty to God, rather than a public sense of duty to one's neighbor and to society generally. I think, however, that the last mentioned characteristic ought to be viewed in relation to a third, namely, c, the extraordinarily democratic tendency of the new religion. Footnote. It is important to note, however, that this same democratic tendency was very marked in Mithraism. Il est certain, says Cumont, qu'il a fait ses premières conquêtes dans les classes inférieures de la société, et c'est là un fait considérable. Le mitracisme est resté longtemps la religion des humbles. Mystère de Mitra, page 68. End of note. Celsus, Anno Domini 200, jeered at the early Christians for their extreme democracy. Quote, "It is only the simpletons, the ignoble, the senseless, slaves and womenfolk and children, whom they wish to persuade to join their churches, or can persuade. Wool dressers and cobblers and fullers, the most uneducated and vulgar persons, and whosoever is a sinner, or unintelligent, or a fool, in a word, whoever is God-forsaken, Greek kakadaimon, him the kingdom of God will receive." End quote. Thus Celsus, the accomplished, clever, philosophic, and withal humorous critic, laughed at the new religionists and prophesied their speedy extinction. Nevertheless, he was mistaken. There is little doubt that just the inclusion of women and weaklings and outcasts did contribute largely to the spread of Christianity and Mithraism. It brought hope and a sense of human dignity to the despised and rejected of the earth. Of the immense numbers of lesser officials who carried on the vast organization of the Roman Empire, most perhaps were taken from the ranks of the freedmen and quondam slaves. Drawn from a great variety of races and already familiar with pagan cults of all kinds, Egyptian, Syrian, Chaldean, Iranian, and so forth. This fact helped to give to Christianity, under the fine tolerance of the empire, its democratic character and also its willingness to accept all. The rude and menial masses, who had hitherto been almost beneath the notice of Greek and Roman culture, flocked in, and though this was doubtless, as time went on, a source of weakness to the Church, and a cause of dissension and superstition, yet it was in the inevitable line of human evolution, and had a psychological basis which I must now endeavor to explain. End of section 24. Read by Sandra near Montreal, 2022. Chapter 14, Part 1 of Pagan and Christian Creeds, Their Origin and Meaning. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Pagan and Christian Creeds, Their Origin and Meaning by Edward Carpenter. The meaning of it all. The general drift and meaning of the present book must now, I think, from many hints scattered in the course of it, be growing clear. But it will be well perhaps in this chapter, at the risk of some repetition, to bring the whole argument together. And the argument is, that since the dawn of humanity on the earth, many hundreds of thousands or perhaps 1,000,000 years ago, there has been a slow psychologic evolution, a gradual development or refinement of consciousness which, at a certain stage, has spontaneously given birth in the human race to the phenomena of religious belief and religious ritual. These phenomena, whether in the race at large or in any branch of it, always following step by step a certain order, depending on the degrees of psychologic evolution concerned, and that it is this general fact which accounts for the strange similarities of belief and ritual which have been observed all over the world and in places far remote from each other, and which have been briefly noted in the preceding chapters. And the main stages of this psychologic evolution, those at any rate with which we are here concerned, are three: the stage of simple consciousness, the stage of self-consciousness, and a third stage which, for want of a better word, we may term the stage of universal consciousness. Of course, these three stages may at some future time be analyzed into lesser degrees with useful result, but at present I only desire to draw attention to them in the rough, so to speak, to show that it is from them, and from their passage one into another, that there has flowed, by a perfectly natural logic and concatenation, the strange panorama of humanity's religious evolution, its superstitions and magic and sacrifices and dancings and ritual generally, and later its incantations and prophecies, and services of speech and verse and paintings and forms of art and figures of the gods. A wonderful panorama indeed, or poem of the centuries, or, if you like, world symphony with three great leading motifs. And first we have the stage of simple consciousness. For hundreds of centuries, we cannot doubt, man possessed a degree of consciousness not radically different from that of the higher animals. though probably more quick and varied. He saw, he heard, he felt, he noted. He acted or reacted quickly or slowly in response to these impressions. But the consciousness of himself as a being separate from his impressions, as separate from his surroundings, had not yet arisen or taken hold on him. He was an instinctive part of nature, and in this respect he was very near to the animals. Self-consciousness in the animals in a germinal form is there, no doubt, but embedded, so to speak, in the general world consciousness. It is on this account that the animals have such a marvelously acute perception and instinct, being embedded in nature, and primitive man had the same. Also we must, as I have said before, allow that man in that stage must have had the same sort of grace and perfection of form and movement as we admire in the wild animals now. It would be quite unreasonable to suppose that he, the crown in the same sense of creation, was from the beginning a lame and ill-made abortion. For a long period the tribes of men, like the tribes of the higher animals, must have been, on the whole, and allowing for occasional privations and sufferings and conflicts, well adapted to their surroundings and harmonious with the earth and with each other. There must have been a period resembling a golden age, some condition at any rate which, compared with subsequent miseries, merited the epithet golden. It was during this period apparently that the system of totems arose. The tribes felt their relationship to their winged and four-footed mates, including also other objects of nature, so deeply and intensely that they adopted the latter as their emblems. The pre-civilized man fairly worshipped the animals and was proud to be called after them. Of course we moderns find this strange, we whose conceptions of these beautiful creatures are mostly derived from a broken-down cab-horse, or a melancholy milk-rummaged cow on a sooty field, or a diseased and despondent lion or eagle at the zoo, have never even seen or loved them, and have only wondered with our true commercial instinct what profit we could extract from them. But they, the primitives, loved and admired the animals. They domesticated many of them by the force of a natural friendship. Footnote. See Chapter 4, Tyler in his Primitive Culture, Volume 1, page 460, edition 1903, says, quote, "The sense of an absolute psychical distinction between man and beast so prevalent in the civilized world is hardly to be found among the lower races." End quote. End of footnote. And accorded them a kind of divinity. This was the age of tribal solidarity and of a latent sense of solidarity with nature. And the point of it all is, with regard to the subject we have in hand, that this was also the age from which, by a natural evolution, the sense of religion came to mankind. If religion in man is the sense of ties, binding his inner self to the powers of the universe around him, then it is evident, I think, that primitive man, as I've described him, possessed the reality of this sense, though so far buried and subconscious that he was hardly aware of it. It was only later, and with the coming of the second stage, that this sense began to rise distinctly into consciousness. Let us pass then to the second stage. There is a moment in the evolution of a child, somewhere perhaps about the age of 3. Footnote. See Buck's Cosmic Consciousness, Philadelphia 1901, pages 1 and 39. Also W. McDougall's Social Psychology 1908, page 146, where the same age is tentatively suggested. End of footnote. When the simple, almost animal-like consciousness of the babe is troubled by a new element, self-consciousness. The change is so marked, so definite, that in the depth of the infant's eyes you can almost see it take place. So in the evolution of the human race there has been a period, also marked and definite, though extending intermittent over a vast interval of time, when on men in general there dawned the consciousness of themselves, of their own thoughts and actions. The old simple acceptance of sensations and experiences gave place to reflection. The question arose, how do these sensations and experiences affect me? What can I do to modify them, to encourage the pleasurable, to avoid or inhibit the painful, and so on? From that moment a new motive was added to life. The mind revolved round a new center. It began to spin like a little eddy round its own axis. It studied itself first and became deeply concerned about its own pleasures and pains, losing touch the while with the larger life which once dominated it, the life of nature, the life of the tribe. The old unity of the spirit, the old solidarity were broken up. I've touched on this subject before, but it is so important that the reader must excuse repetition. There came an inevitable severance, an inevitable period of strife. The magic mirror of the soul, reflecting nature as heretofore in calm and simple grace, was suddenly cracked across. The new self-conscious man, not all at once but gradually, became alienated from his tribe. He lapsed into strife with his fellows. Ambition, vanity, greed, the love of domination, the desire for property and possessions set in. The influences of fellowship and solidarity grew feebler. He became alienated from his great mother. His instincts were less and less sure, and that in proportion as brain activity and self-regarding calculation took their place. Love and mutual help were less compelling in proportion as the demands of self-interest grew louder and more insistent. Ultimately, the crisis came. Cain murdered his brother and became an outcast. The Garden of Eden and the Golden Age closed their gates behind him. He entered upon a period of suffering, a period of labor and toil and sorrow such as he'd never known before, and such as the animals certainly have never known. And in that distressful state, in that doleful valley of his long pilgrimage, he still remains today. Thus has the canker of self-consciousness done its work. It would be foolish and useless to rail against the process, or to blame any one for it. It had to be. Through this dismal veil of self-seeking mankind had to pass, if only in order at last to find the true self, which was and still remains its goal. The pilgrimage will not last forever. Indeed, there are signs that the recent Great War and the following events mark the lowest point of descent and the beginning of the human soul's return to sanity and ascent towards the heavenly kingdom. No doubt man will arrive again some day at the grace, composure, and leisurely beauty of life which the animals realized long ago, though he seems a precious long time about it, and when all this nightmare of greed and vanity and self-conceit and cruelty and lust of oppression and domination which marks the present period is past, and it will pass, then humanity will come again to its golden age and to that paradise of redemption and peace which has for so long been prophesied. But we are dealing with the origins of religion. And what I want the reader to see is that it was just this breaking up of the old psychologic unity and continuity of man with his surroundings which led to the whole panorama of the rituals and creeds. Man, centering round himself, necessarily became an exile from the great whole. He committed the sin, if it was a sin, of separation. Anyhow, Nemesis was swift. The sense of loneliness and the sense of guilt came on him. The realization of himself as a separate conscious being necessarily led to his attributing a similar consciousness of some kind to the great life around him. Action and reaction are equal and opposite. Whatever he may have felt before, it became clear to him now that beings more or less like himself, though doubtless vaster and more powerful, moved behind the veil of the visible world. From that moment, the belief in magic and demons and gods arose or slowly developed itself. And in the midst of this turmoil of perilous and conflicting powers, he perceived himself an alien and an exile, stricken with fear, stricken with the sense of sin. If before he had experienced fear, in the kind of automatic way of self-preservation in which the animals feel it, he now, with fevered self-regard and excited imagination, experienced it in double or treble degree. And if before he had been aware that fortune and chance were not always friendly and propitious to his designs, he now perceived or thought he perceived in every adverse happening the deliberate persecution of the powers, and an accusation of guilt directed against him for some neglect or deficiency in his relation to them. Hence, by a perfectly logical and natural sequence, there arose the belief in other world or supernatural powers, whether purely fortuitous and magical, or more distinctly rational and personal. There arose the sense of sin, or of offense against these powers. There arose a complex ritual of expiation, whether by personal sacrifice and suffering, or by the sacrifice of victims. There arose, too, a whole catalogue of ceremonies of initiation, by which the novice should learn to keep within the good grace of the powers, and under the blessing of his tribe and the protection of its totem, ceremonies of Eucharistic meals which should restore the lost sanctity of the common life and remove the sense of guilt and isolation, ceremonies of marriage, and rules and rites of sex connection, fitted to curb the terrific and demonic violence of passions, which else indeed might easily rend the community asunder, and so on. It's easy to see that granted an early stage of simple, unreflecting nature consciousness, and granting this broken into and after a time shattered by the arrival of self-consciousness, there would necessarily follow in spontaneous yet logical order a whole series of religious institutions and beliefs, which, phantasmal and unreal as they may appear to us, were by no means unreal to our ancestors. It is easy also to see that as the psychological process was necessarily of similar general character in every branch of the human race and all over the world, so the religious evolutions, the creeds and rituals, took on much the same complexion everywhere, and though they differed in details according to climate and other influences, ran on such remarkably parallel lines as we have noted. Finally, to make the whole matter clear, let me repeat that this event, the inbreak of self-consciousness, took place or began to take place an enormous time ago, perhaps in the beginning of the Neolithic age. I dwell on the word began because I think it is probable that in its beginnings and for a long period after, this newborn consciousness had an infantile and very innocent character, quite different from its later and more aggressive forms, just as we see self-consciousness in a little child has a charm and a grace which it loses later in a boastful or grasping boyhood and manhood. So we may understand that though self-consciousness may have begun to appear in the human race at this very early time, and more or less contemporaneously with the invention of very rude tools and unformed language, there probably did elapse a very long period, perhaps the whole of the Neolithic age, before the evils of this second stage of human evolution came to a head. Max Muller has pointed out that among the words which are common to the various branches of Aryan language, and which therefore belong to the very early period before the separation of these branches, there are not found the words denoting war and conflict and the weapons and instruments of strife, a fact which suggests a long continuance of peaceful habit among mankind after the first formation and use of language. That the birth of language and the birth of self-consciousness were approximately simultaneous is a probable theory, and one favored by many thinkers. Footnote: Dr. Buck, Cosmic Consciousness, insists on their simultaneity, but places both events excessively far back, as we should think, that is, 200,000 or 300,000 years ago. Possibly he does not differentiate sufficiently between the rude language of the hollow phrase and the much later growth of formed and grammatical speech. End of footnote. But the slow beginnings of both must have been so very protracted that it is perhaps useless to attempt any very exact determination. Late researches seem to show that language began in what might be called tribal expressions of mood and feeling, hollow phrases like "go hunting, kill bear," without reference to individual personalities and relationships, and that it was only at a later stage that words like "I" and "thou" came into use, and the hollow phrases broke up into parts of speech and took on a definite grammatical structure. Footnote: C. A. E. Crawley's Idea of the Soul, Chapter 2, Jane Harrison's Themis, pages 473-5, and E. J. Payne's History of the New World Called America, Volume 2, pages 15 forward, where the beginning of self-consciousness is associated with the breakup of the hollow phrase. End of footnote. If true, these facts point clearly to a long foreground of rude communal language, something like, though greatly superior to, that of the animals, preceding or preparing the evolution of self-consciousness proper, in the forms of I and thou, and the grammar of personal actions and relations. They show that the plural and all other forms of number in grammar arise not by multiplication of an original I, but by selection and gradual exclusion from an original collective we. According to this view, the birth of self-consciousness in the human family, or in any particular race or section of the human family, must have been equally slow and hesitating, and it would be easy to imagine, as just said, that there may have been a very long and golden period at its beginning, before the new consciousness took on its maturer and harsher forms. End of section 25. Read by Sandra, near Montreal, 2022. Chapter 14, Part 2 of Pagan and Christian Creeds, Their Origin and Meaning. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Pagan and Christian Creeds, Their Origin and Meaning by Edward Carpenter. The Meaning of It All, Part 2. All estimates of the time involved in these evolutions of early man are notoriously most divergent and most difficult to be sure of. But if we take 500,000 years ago for the first appearance of veritable man, Homo primigenius, footnote, though Dr. Arthur Keith, Ancient Types of Man, 1911, page 93 and 102, puts the figure at more like 1 million, end footnote, and following Professor W.J. Solas, footnote, see Ancient Hunters, 1915, also Hastings' Encyclopedia article Ethnology, and Havelock Ellis, The Origin of War in the Philosophy of Conflict and Other Essays, end footnote. 30,000 or 40,000 years ago for the first tool-using men, Homo sapiens of the Chilean age, Paleolithic, 15,000 for the rock paintings and inscriptions of the Aurignacian and Magdalenian peoples, and 5,000 years ago for the first actual historical records that have come down to us, we may perhaps get something like a proportion between the different periods. That is to say, 500,000 years for the purely animal man in his different forms and grades of evolution. Then somewhere towards the end of Paleolithic or commencement of Neolithic times, self-consciousness dimly beginning, and after some 10,000 years of slow germination and prehistoric culture, culminating in the actual historic period and the dawn of civilization 40 or 50 centuries ago. And today, we hope, reaching the climax which precedes or foretells its abatement and transformation. No doubt many geologists and anthropologists would favor periods greatly longer than those here mentioned, but possibly there would be some agreement as to the ratio to each other of the times concerned. That is, the said authorities would probably allow for a very long animal man period. Footnote. I use the phrase animal man here not with any flavor of contempt or reprobation as the dear Victorians would have used it, but with a sense of genuine respect and admiration such as one feels towards the animals themselves. End footnote. Corresponding to the first stage, for a much shorter aggressively self-conscious period, corresponding to the second stage, perhaps lasting only 1/30th or 50th of the time of the first period, and then if they look forward at all to a third stage, would be inclined for obvious reasons to attribute to that again a very extended duration. However, all this is very speculative. To return to the difficulty about language and the consideration of those early times when words adequate to the expression of religious or magical ideas simply did not exist, it is clear that the only available, or at any rate the chief means of expression in those times, must have consisted in gestures, in attitudes, in ceremonial actions, in a more or less elaborate ritual, in fact, such ideas as adoration, thanksgiving, confessions of guilt, placation of wrath, expiation, sacrifice, celebration of community, sacramental atonement, and a score of others could at that time be expressed by appropriate rites, and as a matter of fact are often so expressed even now, more readily and directly than by language. Dancing, when that word came to be invented, did not mean a mere flinging about of the limbs in recreation, but any expressive movements of the body which might be used to convey the feelings of the dancer or of the audience whom he represented. And so the religious dance became a most important part of ritual. So much for the second stage of consciousness. Let us now pass on to the third stage. It is evident that the process of disruption and dissolution, disruption both of the human mind and of society round about it, due to the action of the second stage, could not go on indefinitely. There are hundreds of thousands of people at the present moment who are dying of mental or bodily disease, their nervous systems broken down by troubles connected with excessive self-consciousness, selfish fears and worries and restlessness. Society at large is perishing, both in industry and in warfare, through the domination in its organism of the self-motives of greed and vanity and ambition. This cannot go on forever. Things must either continue in the same strain, in which case it is evident that we are approaching a crisis of utter dissolution, or a new element must enter in, a new inspiration of life, and we, as individuals in the society of which we form a part, must make a fresh start. What is that new and necessary element of regeneration? It is evident that it must be a new birth, the entry into a further stage of consciousness which must supersede the present one, through some such crisis as we have spoken of. Through the extreme of suffering, the mind of man, as at present constituted, has to die. Footnote: the mind must be restrained in the heart till it comes to an end, says the Maitrayana Brahmana Upanishad. End of footnote. Self-consciousness has to die and be buried and rise again in a new form. Probably nothing but the extreme of suffering can bring this about. Footnote: one may remember in this connection the tapas of the Hindu yogi, or the ordeals of initiates into the pagan mysteries generally. End of footnote. And what is this new form in which consciousness has to re-arise? Obviously, since the miseries of the world during countless centuries have dated from that fatal attempt to make the little personal self the center of effort and activity, and since that attempt has inevitably led to disunity and discord and death, both within the mind itself and within the body of society, there's nothing left but the return to a consciousness which shall have unity as its foundation principle, and which shall proceed from the direct sense and perception of such an unity throughout creation. The simple mind of early man and the animals was of that character, a consciousness, so to speak, continuous through nature, and though running to points of illumination and foci of special activity in individuals, yet at no point essentially broken or imprisoned in separate compartments. And it is this continuity of the primitive mind which enables us, as I've already explained, to understand the mysterious workings of instinct and intuition. To some such unity consciousness we have to return, but clearly it is not of the simple inchoate character of the first stage, for it has been enriched, deepened, and greatly extended by the experience of the second stage. It is in fact a new order of mentality, the consciousness of the third stage. In order to understand the operation and qualities of this third consciousness, it may be of assistance just now to consider in what more or less rudimentary way or ways it figured in the pagan rituals and in Christianity. We've seen the rude cyber yaks in northeastern Asia, or the grizzly tribes of North American Indians in the neighborhood of Mount Shasta, paying their respects and adoration to a captive bear, at once the food animal and the divinity of the tribe. A tribesman had slain a bear, and be it said had slain it not in a public hunt with all due ceremonies observed, but privately for his own satisfaction. He had committed, therefore, a sin theoretically unpardonable, for had he not, to gratify his personal desire for food, levelled a blow at the guardian spirit of the tribe? Had he not alienated himself from his fellows by destroying its very symbol? There was only one way by which he could regain the fellowship of his companions. He must make amends by some public sacrifice, and instead of retaining the flesh of the animal for himself, he must share it with the whole tribe or clan in a common feast, while at the same time tensest prayers and thanks are offered to the animal for the gift of his body for food. The magic formula demanded nothing less than this, else dread disaster would fall upon the man who sinned and upon the whole brotherhood. Here and in 100 similar rites we see the 3 phases of tribal psychology. The first, in which the individual member simply remains within the compass of the tribal mind, and only acts in harmony with it. The second, in which the individual steps outside and, to gratify his personal self, performs an action which alienates him from his fellows. And the third, in which, to make amends and to prove his sincerity, he submits to some sacrifice, and by a common feast or some such ceremony is received back again into the unity of the fellowship. The body of the animal divinity is consumed, and the latter becomes, both in the spirit and in the flesh, the savior of the tribe. In course of time, when the totem or guardian spirit is no longer merely an animal or animal-headed genius, but a quite human-formed divinity, still the same general outline of ideas is preserved, only with gathered intensity, owing to the specially human interest of the drama. The divinity who gives his life for his flock is no longer just an ordinary bull or lamb, but Adonis or Osiris or Dionysus or Jesus. He is betrayed by one of his own followers and suffers death, but rises again, redeeming all with himself in the one fellowship, and the corn and the wine and the wild flesh which were his body, and which he gave for the sustenance of mankind, are consumed in a holy supper of reconciliation. It's always the return to unity which is the ritual of salvation, and of which the symbol is the Eucharist. The second birth, the formation of a new creature when old things are passed away. For, "Except a man be born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God, and the first man is of the earth, earthly, but the second man is the Lord from heaven." Like a strange refrain, and from centuries before our era comes down this belief in a God who's imprisoned in each man, and whose liberation is a new birth and the beginning of a new creature. "Rejoice, ye initiates, in the mystery of the liberated God." Rejoice in the thought of the hero who died as a mortal in the coffin, but rises again as Lord of all. Who then was this Christos, for whom the world was waiting 3 centuries before our era, and indeed centuries before that? Who was this thrice Saviour, whom the Greek Gnostics acclaimed? What was the meaning of that coming of the Son of Man, whom Daniel beheld in vision among the clouds of heaven, or of the perfect man, whom Paul declared should deliver us from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God? What was this salvation which time after time and times again the pagan deities promised to their devotees, and which the Eleusinian and other mysteries represented in their religious dramas with such convincing enthusiasm that even Pindar could say, "Happy is he who has seen them, the mysteries, before he goes beneath the hollow earth, that man knows the true end of life and its source divine," and concerning which Sophocles and Aeschylus were equally enthusiastic. Can we doubt, in the light of all that we have already said, what the answer to these questions is? As with the first blossoming of self-consciousness in the human mind, came the dawn of an immense cycle of experience, a cycle indeed of exile from Eden, of suffering and toil and blind wanderings in the wilderness, yet a cycle absolutely necessary and unavoidable. So now the redemption, the return, the restoration has to come through another forward step in the same domain. Abandoning the quest and the glorification of the separate isolated self, we have to return to the cosmic universal life. It is the blossoming indeed of this new life in the depths of our minds which is salvation, and which all the expressions which I have just cited have indicated. It is this presence which all down the ages has been hailed as Saviour and Liberator. The daybreak of a consciousness so much vaster, so much more glorious than all that has gone before, that the little candle of the local self is swallowed up in its rays. It is the return home, the return into direct touch with nature and man, the liberation from the long exile of separation, from the painful sense of isolation and the odious nightmare of guilt and sin. Can we doubt that this new birth, this third stage of consciousness, if we like to call it so, has to come, that it is indeed not merely a pious hope or a tentative theory, but a fact, testified to already by a cloud of witnesses in the past, witnesses shining in their own easily recognizable and authentic light, yet for the most part isolated from each other among the arid and unfruitful wastes of civilization, like glowworms in the dry grass of a summer night? Since the first dim evolution of human self-consciousness, an immense period, as we've said, perhaps 30,000 years, perhaps even more, has elapsed. Now, in the present day, this period is reaching its culmination, and though it will not terminate immediately, its end is, so to speak, in sight. Meanwhile, during all the historical age behind us, save for the last 4,000 or 5,000 years, evidence has been coming in, partly in the religious rites recorded, partly in oracles, poems, and prophetic literature, of the onset of this further illumination, the light which never was on sea or land. And the cloud of witnesses scattered at first has in these later centuries become so evident and so notable that we are tempted to believe in or to anticipate a great and general new birth, as now not so very far off. Footnote. For an amplification of all this theme, see Dr. Buck's remarkable and epoch-making book, Cosmic Consciousness, first published in Philadelphia, 1901. End of footnote. Many a time already in the history the millennium has been prophesied, and yet not arrived punctual to date. and to take to ourselves the words of Peter, who, somewhat grievously disappointed at the long-delayed second coming of the Lord Jesus in the clouds of heaven, wrote in his second epistle, quote, "There shall come in the last days scoffers, walking after their own lusts, and saying, Where is the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of the creation." End quote. I say that all through the historical age behind us there has been evidence, even though scattered, of salvation and the return of the cosmic life. Man has never been so completely submerged in the bitter sea of self-centeredness but what he has occasionally been able to dash the spray from his eyes and glimpse the sun and the glorious light of heaven. From how far back we cannot say, but from an immense antiquity come the beautiful myths which indicate this. Quote, "Cinderella, the cinder maiden, sits unbeknown in her earthly hutch. Gibed and jeered at, she bewails her lonely fate. Nevertheless, youngest born, she surpasses her sisters and endues a garment of the sun and stars. From a tiny spark she ascends, and irradiates the universe, and is wedded to the Prince of Heaven." End quote. How lovely this vision of the little maiden sitting unbeknown, close to the hearth fire of the universe, herself indeed just a little spark from it, despised and rejected by the world, despised by her two elder sisters, the body and the intellect. Yet she, the soul, though latest born, by far the most beautiful of the three, and of the Prince of Love, who redeems and sets her free, and of her wedding garment, the glory and beauty of all nature and of the heavens. The parables of Jesus are charming in their way, but they hardly reach this height of inspiration. Or the world-old myth of Eros and Psyche. How strange that here again there are three sisters, the three stages of human evolution, and the latest born, the most beautiful of the three, and the jealousies and persecutions heaped on the youngest by the others, and especially by Aphrodite, the goddess of mere sensual charm. And again the coming of the unknown, the unseen lover on whom it is not permitted for mortals to look, and the long, long tests and sufferings and trials which Psyche has to undergo before Eros may really take her to his arms and translate her to the heights of heaven. Can we not imagine how, when these things were represented in the mysteries, the world flocked to see them, and the poets indeed said, "Happy are they that see and seeing can understand"? Can we not understand how it was that the Amphictyonic decree of the 2nd century BC spoke of these same mysteries as enforcing the lesson that the greatest of human blessings is fellowship and mutual trust? End of section 26. Read by Sandra, near Montreal, 2022. Chapter 15, Part 1 of Pagan and Christian Creeds, Their Origin and Meaning. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Pagan and Christian Creeds, Their Origin and Meaning by Edward Carpenter. The Ancient Mysteries. Thus we come to a thing which we must not pass over, because it throws great light on the meaning and interpretation of all these rites and ceremonies of the great world religion. I mean the subject of the ancient mysteries, and to this I will give a few pages. These mysteries were probably survivals of the oldest religious rites of the Greek races, and in their earlier forms constituted not so much in worship of the gods of heaven as of the divinities of earth and of nature and death. Crude, no doubt, at first, they gradually became, especially in their Eleusinian form, more refined and philosophical. The rites were gradually thrown open, on certain conditions, not only to men generally, but also to women, and even to slaves, and in the end they influenced Christianity deeply. There were apparently three forms of teaching made use of in these rites. These were Greek legomena, things said, deiknomena, things shown, and dromena, things performed or acted. I have given already some instances of things said, texts whispered for consolation in the neophyte's ear, and so forth. Of the third group, things enacted, we have a fair amount of evidence. There were ritual dramas or passion plays, of which an important one dealt with the descent of Kore or Proserpina into the underworld, as in the Eleusinian representations, and her redemption and restoration to the upper world in spring, another with the sufferings of Psyche and her rescue by Eros, as described by Apuleius, himself an initiate in the cult of Isis. There is a parody by Lucian, which tells of the birth of Apollo, the marriage of Coronis, and the coming of Aesculapius as saviour. There was the dying and rising again of Dionysus, chief divinity of the Orphic cult, and sometimes the mystery of the birth of Dionysus as a holy child. There was every year at Eleusis a solemn and lengthy procession or pilgrimage made, symbolic of the long pilgrimage of the human soul, its sufferings and deliverance. Almost always, says Dr. Cheetham, quote, the suffering of a god, suffering followed by a triumph, seems to have been the subject of the sacred drama. End quote. Then occasionally to the neophytes after taking part in the pilgrimage, and when their minds had been prepared by an ordeal of darkness and fatigue and terrors, was accorded a revelation of paradise and even a vision of transfiguration, the form of the Hierophant himself or teacher of the mysteries being seen half lost in a blaze of light. Finally, there was the eating of food and drinking of barley drink from the sacred chest, a kind of communion or Eucharist. Footnote. Sacred chests, in which holy things were kept, figure frequently in early rites and legends, as in the case of the Ark of the Jewish tabernacle, the Ark or box carried in celebrations of the mysteries of Bacchus, the legend of Pandora's box, which contained the seeds of all good and evil, the Ark of Noah, which saved all living creatures from the flood, the Argo of the Argonauts, the moon-shaped boat in which Isis, floating over the waters, gathered together the severed limbs of Osiris, and so brought about his resurrection, and the many chests or coffins out of which the various gods, Adonis, Attis, Osiris, Jesus, having been laid there in death, rose again for the redemption of the world. They all evidently refer to the mystic womb of nature and of woman, and are symbols of salvation and redemption. For a full discussion of this subject, see The Great Law of Religious Origins by W. Williamson, Chapter 4. End of footnote. Apuleius, in The Golden Ass, gives an interesting account of his induction into the mysteries of Isis. Bidding farewell one evening to the general congregation outside, and clothed in a new linen garment, he was handed by the priest into the inner recesses of the temple itself. How he, quote, approached the confines of death, and having trod on the threshold of Proserpina, the underworld, returned therefrom, being borne through all the elements. At midnight I saw the sun shining with its brilliant light, and I approached the presence of the gods beneath and the gods above, and stood near and worshipped them. Unquote. During the night things happened which must not be disclosed, but in the morning he came forth, quote, consecrated by being dressed in 12 stoles, painted with the figures of animals. Unquote. Footnote. An allusion no doubt to the 12 signs of the zodiac, the pathway of the sun, as well as to the practice of the ancient priests of wearing the skins of totem animals in sign of their divinity. End of footnote. He ascended a pulpit in the midst of the temple, carrying in his right hand a burning torch, while a chaplet encircled his head, from which palm leaves projected like rays of light. Quote, thus arrayed like the sun, and placed so as to resemble a statue, on a sudden, the curtains being drawn aside, I was exposed to the gaze of the multitude. After this I celebrated the most joyful day of my initiation, as my natal day, day of the new birth, and there was a joyous banquet and mirthful conversation. End quote. One can hardly refuse to recognize in this account the description of some kind of ceremony which was supposed to seal the illumination of a man and his new birth into divinity, the animal origin, the circling of all experience, the terrors of death, and the resurrection in the form of the sun, the symbol of all light and life. The very word illumination carries the ideas of light and a new birth with it. Reitzenstein, in his very interesting book on the Greek mysteries, footnote, Die Hellenistischen Mysterienreligionen, Leipzig, 1910, end of footnote, speaks over and over again of the illumination, Greek phutismos, which was held to attend initiation and salvation. The doctrine of salvation indeed, Greek sothria, was, as we have already seen, rife and widely current in the 2nd century BC. It represented a real experience, and the man who shared this experience became a Greek chaos, ankeropos, or a divine man. In the Orphic tablets, the phrase, quote, "I am a child of earth and the starry heaven, but my race is of heaven alone," end quote, occurs more than once. In one of the longest of them, the dead man is instructed, quote, "after he has passed the waters of Lethe, where the white cypress and the house of Hades are," end quote, to address these very words to the guardians of the lake of memory while he asks for a drink of cold water from the lake. In another, the dead person himself is thus addressed, quote, "Hail, thou who hast endured the suffering, such as indeed thou hast never suffered before. Thou hast become God from man." End quote. Footnote. These tablets, so called, are instructions to the dead as to their passage into the other world, and have been found in the tombs in Italy and elsewhere, inscribed on very thin gold plates and buried with the departed. See Manual of Greek Antiquities by Percy Gardner and F. B. Jerome, 1896. Also Prolegomena to Greek Religion by Jane E. Harrison, 1908. End of footnote. Ecstasy was the acme of the religious life, and what is especially interesting to us, salvation, or the divine nature, was open to all men, to all, that is, who should go through the necessary stages of preparation for it. Reitzenstein contends that in the mysteries, transfiguration, Greek metamorphosis, salvation, Greek sophria, and new birth, Greek palingenesia, were often conjoined. He says that in the Egyptian Osiris cult, the initiate acquires a nature equal to God, Greek isokoios, the very same expression as that used of Christ Jesus in Philippians 2:6. He mentions Apollonius of Tyana and Sergius Paulus as instances of men who by their contemporaries were considered to have attained this nature, and he quotes Akhenaton, Pharaoh of Egypt in 1373 before Christ, as having said, quote, "Thou art in my heart, none other knows thee, save thy son Akhenaton. Thou hast initiated him into thy wisdom and into thy power." End quote. He also quotes the words of Hermes, Trismegistus, quote, "Come unto me, even as children to their mother's bosom. Thou art I, and I am thou. What is thine is mine, and what is mine is thine. For indeed I am thine image." Greek, eidolon. End quote. And refers to the dialogue between Hermes and Tat, in which they speak of the great and mystic new birth and union with the all, with all elements, plants and animals, time and space. The mysteries, says Dr. Cheetham very candidly, quote, "influenced Christianity considerably and modified it in some important respects." And Dr. Hatch, as we've seen, not only supports this general view, but follows it out in detail. He points out that the membership of the mystery societies was very numerous in the earliest times, Anno Domini, and that their general aims were good, including a sense of true religion, decent life and brotherhood, that cleanness from crime and confession were demanded from the neophyte, that confession was followed by baptism, Greek kakharsis, and that by sacrifice, that the term, Greek phostismos, illumination, was adopted by the Christian Church as the name for the new birth of baptism, that the Christian usage of placing a seal on the forehead came from the same source, that baptism itself after a time was called a mystery, Greek mousirio, that the sacred cakes and barley drink of the mysteries became the milk and honey and bread and wine of the first Christian Eucharists, and that the occasional sacrifice of a lamb on the Christian altar, whose mention is often suppressed, probably originated in the same way. Indeed, the conception of the communion table as an altar and many other points of ritual gradually established themselves from these sources as time went on. It is hardly necessary to say more in proof of the extent to which in these ancient representations things said and scenes enacted forestalled the doctrines and ceremonials of Christianity. Quote, "But what of the second group above mentioned, the things shown? It is not so easy, naturally, to get exact information concerning these, but they seem to have been especially holy objects, probably things connected with very ancient rituals in the past, such as sacred stones, old and rude images of the gods, magic nature symbols like that half-disclosed ear of corn above mentioned. Chapter 5. In the temple of Isis at Philae, says Dr. Cheetham, quote, the dead body of Osiris is represented with stalks of corn springing from it, which a priest waters from a vessel. An inscription says, this is the form of him whom we may not name, Osiris of the mysteries, who sprang from the returning waters, the Nile. End quote. Above all, no doubt, there were images of the phallus and the vulva, the great symbols of human fertility. We have seen, in Chapter 12, that the lingam and the yoni are, even down to today, commonly retained and honored as holy objects in the South Indian temples, and anointed with oil, some of them, for a very practical reason. Sir J. G. Fraser, in his lately published volumes on the folklore of the Old Testament, has a chapter in Volume 2 on the very numerous sacred stones of various shapes and sizes found or spoken of in Palestine and other parts of the world. Though uncertain as to the meaning of these stones, he mentions that they are frequently, though not always, upright. End quote. Anointing them with oil, he assures us, quote, is a widespread practice, sometimes by women who wish to obtain children. End quote. And he concludes the chapter by saying, quote, the holy stone at Bethel was probably one of those massive standing stones or rough pillars which the Hebrews called Masaboth, and which, as we have seen, were regular adjuncts of Canaanite and early Israelitish sanctuaries. End quote. We've already mentioned the pillars Jachin and Boaz, which stood before the Temple of Solomon, and which had an acknowledged sexual significance, and so it seems probable that a great number of these holy stones had a similar meaning. Following this clue, it would appear likely that the lingam, thus anointed and worshipped in the temples of India and elsewhere, is the original Greek Christos, adored by the human race from the very beginning, and that at a later time, when the priest and the king, as objects of worship, took the place of the lingam, they also were anointed with the chrism of fertility. That the exhibition of these emblems should be part of the original mystery rituals was perfectly natural, especially because, as we've explained already, old customs often continued on in a quite naive fashion in the rituals, when they had come to be thought indecent or improper by a later public opinion, and we may say was perfectly in order because there's plenty of evidence to show that in savage initiations, of which the mysteries were the linear descendants, all these things were explained to the novices and their use actually taught. Footnote. See Ernest Crawley's Mystic Rose. In certain tribes of Central Africa, both boys and girls after initiation must as soon as possible have intercourse, initiation being not merely preliminary to, but often actually marriage. The same among Kafirs, Congo tribes, Senegalese, etc., also among the Arunta of Australia. End footnote. No doubt there were also some representations or dramatic incidents of a fairly coarse character deriving from these ancient sources. It is, however, quaint to observe how the mere mention of such things has caused an almost hysterical commotion among the critics of the mysteries, from the day of the early Christians, who, in order to belaud their own religion, were never tired of abusing the pagans, onward to the present day, when modern scholars either on the one hand follow the early Christians in representing the mysteries as sinks of iniquity, or on the other hand, knowing this charge could not be substantiated except in the period of their final decadence, take the line of ignoring the sexual interest attaching to them as non-existent, or at any rate unworthy of attention. The good Archdeacon Cheetham, for instance, while writing an interesting book on the mysteries, passes by this side of the subject almost as if it did not exist, while the learned Dr. Farnell, overcome apparently by the weight of his learning and unable to confront the alarming obstacle presented by these sexual rites and aspects, hides himself behind the rather non-committal remark, speaking of the Eleusinian rites, quote, we have no right to imagine any part of this solemn ceremony as coarse or obscene. End quote. As nature, however, has been known quite frequently to be coarse or obscene, and as the initiators of the mysteries were probably neither good nor learned, but were simply anxious to interpret nature as best they could, we cannot find fault with the latter for the way they handled the problem, nor indeed well see how they could have handled it better. Footnote. F. Norck, in Der Mystagog, mentions that the Roman Penates were commonly anointed with oil. J. Stuart Hay, in his Life of Elagabalus, 1911, says that, quote, Elagabal was worshipped under the symbol of a great black stone or meteorite in the shape of a phallus, which having fallen from the heavens represented a true portion of the Godhead, much after the style of those black stone images popularly venerated in Norway and other parts of Europe. End quote. End footnote. End of section 27. Read by Sandra. Chapter 15, Part 2 of Pagan and Christian Creeds, Their Origin and Meaning. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Pagan and Christian Creeds, Their Origin and Meaning by Edward Carpenter. The Ancient Mysteries, Part 2. After all, it is pretty clear that the early people saw in sex the great cohesive force which kept, we will not say humanity, but at any rate the tribe, together, and sustained the race. In the stage of simple consciousness, this must have been one of the first things that the budding intellect perceived. Sex became one of the earliest divinities, and there is abundant evidence that its organs and processes generally were invested with a religious sense of awe and sanctity. It was in fact the symbol, or rather the actuality, of the permanent, undying life of the race, and as such was sacred to the uses of the race. Whatever taboos may have among different peoples guarded its operations. It was not essentially a thing to be concealed or ashamed of, rather the contrary. For instance, the early Christian writer Hippolytus, Bishop of Pontus, Anno Domini 200, in his Refutation of All Heresies, Book 5, says that the Samothracian mysteries, just mentioned, celebrate Adam as the primal or archetypal man, eternal in the heavens, and he then continues, quote, habitually there stand in the temple of the Samothracians 2 images of naked men, having both hands stretched aloft towards heaven, and their pudenda turned upwards, as is also the case with the statue of Mercury on Mount Cyllene. And the aforesaid images are figures of the primal man and of that spiritual one which is born again, in every respect of the same substance with that first man. End quote. This extract from Hippolytus occurs in the long discourse in which he exposes the heresy of the so-called Nicene doctrines and mysteries, but the whole discourse should be read by those who wish to understand the Gnostic philosophy of the period contemporary with and anterior to the birth of Christianity. A translation of the discourse, carefully analyzed and annotated, is given in G.R.S. Mead's Thrice Greatest Hermes, and Mead himself, speaking of it, says, quote, the claim of these Gnostics was practically that the good news of the Christ, the Christos, was the consummation of the inner doctrine of the mystery institutions of all the nations, the end of them all being the revelation of the mystery of man. End quote. Further, he explains that the soul in these doctrines was regarded as synonymous with the cause of all, and that its loves were twain, of Aphrodite or life, and of Persephone or death and the other world. Also that Attis, abandoning his sex in the worship of the mother goddess Dea Syria, ascends to heaven, a new man, male-female, and the origin of all things, the hidden mystery being the phallus itself, erected as Hermes in all roads and boundaries and temples, the conductor and reconductor of souls. All this may sound strange, but one may fairly say that it represented in its degree and in that first unfallen stage of human thought and psychology a true conception of the cosmic life, and indeed a conception quite sensible and admirable until, of course, the second stage brought corruption. No sooner was this great force of the cosmic life diverted from its true uses of generation and regeneration, and appropriated by the individual to his own private pleasure, no sooner was its religious character as a tribal service, often rendered within the temple precincts, lost sight of or degraded into a commercial transaction, than every kind of evil fell upon mankind. Corruptio optimi pessima. Footnote. Ernest Crawley in The Mystic Rose challenges this identification of religion with tribal interests, yet his arguments are not very convincing. On page 5 he admits that there is a religious meaning inherent in the primitive conception and practice of all human relations, and a large part of his chapter 12 is taken up in showing that even such institutions as the Saturnalia were religious in confirming the sense of social union and leading to extended identity. End of footnote. It must be remembered, too, that simultaneous with this sexual disruption occurred the disruption of other human relations, and we cease to be surprised that disease and self-passions, greed, jealousy, slander, cruelty, and wholesale murder raged and have raged ever since. But for the human soul, whatever its fate and whatever the dangers and disasters that threaten it, there is always redemption waiting. As we saw in the last chapter, this corruption of sex led quite naturally to its denial and rejection, and its denial led to the differentiation from it of love. Humanity gained by the enthronement and deification of love, pure and undefiled, and for the time being exalted beyond this mortal world, and free from all earthly contracts. But again, in the end, the divorce thus introduced between the physical and the spiritual led to the crippling of both. Love relegated, so to speak, to heaven as a purely philanthropical, pious, and spiritual affair, became exceedingly dull, and sex, remaining on earth, but deserted by the redeeming presence, fell into a mere carnal curiosity and wretchedness of unclean living. Obviously, for the human race there remains nothing in the final event but the reconciliation of the physical and the spiritual, and after many sufferings, the reunion of Eros and Psyche. There is still, however, much to be said about the third state of consciousness. Let us examine into it a little more closely. Clearly, since it is a new state, and not merely an extension of a former one cannot arrive at it by argument derived from the second state, for all conscious thought such as we habitually use simply keeps us in the second state. No animal or quite primitive man could possibly understand what we mean by self-consciousness till he had experienced it. Mere argument would not enlighten him, and so no one in the second state can quite realize the third state till he's experienced it. Still, explanations may help us to perceive in what direction to look, and to recognize in some of our experiences an approach to the condition sought. Evidently, it is a mental condition in some respects more similar to the first than to the second stage. The second stage of human psychologic evolution is an aberration, a divorce, a parenthesis. With its culmination and dismissal, the mind passes back into the simple state of union with the whole, the state of ekagrata in the Hindu philosophy, one-pointedness, singleness of mind. And the consciousness of the whole, and of things past and things to come and things far around, which consciousness had been shut out by the concentration on the local self, begins to return again. This is not to say, of course, that the excursus in the second stage has been a loss and a defect. On the contrary, it means that the return is a bringing of all that has been gained during the period of exile, all sorts of mental and technical knowledge and skill, emotional developments, finesse, and adaptability of mind, back into harmony with the whole. It means ultimately a great gain. The man, perfected, comes back to a vastly extended harmony. He enters again into a real understanding and confidential relationship with his physical body and with the body of the society in which he dwells, from both of which he's been sadly divorced, and he takes up again the broken thread of the cosmic life. Everyone has noticed the extraordinary consent sometimes observable among the members of an animal community, how a flock of 500 birds, for example starlings, will suddenly change its direction of flight, the light on the wings shifting instantaneously as if the impulse to veer came to all at the same identical moment, or how bees will swarm or otherwise act with one accord, or migrating creatures, lemmings, deer, gossamer spiders, winged ants, the same. Whatever explanation of these facts we favor, whether the possession of swifter and finer means of external communication than we can perceive, or whether a common and inner sensitivity to the genius of the tribe, the spirit of the hive, or to the promptings of great nature around, in any case these facts of animal life appear to throw light on the possibilities of an accord and consent among the members of emancipated humanity, such as we dream of now, and seem to bid us to have good hope for the future. It is here, perhaps, that the ancient worship of the lingam comes in. The word itself is apparently connected with our word link, and has originally the same meaning. It is the link between the generations. Beginning with the worship of the physical race life, the course of psychologic evolution has been first to the worship of the tribe, or of the totem, which represents the tribe, then to the worship of the human-formed god of the tribe, the god who dies and rises again eternally as the tribe passes on eternal, though its members perpetually perish, then to the conception of an undying Savior and the realization and distinct experience of some kind of superconsciousness, which does certainly reside more or less hidden in the deeps of the mind, and has been waiting through the ages for its disclosure and recognition. Then again to the recognition that in the sacrifices the slayer and the slain are one, the strange and profoundly mystic perception that the god and the victim are in essence the same, the dedication of himself to himself, and simultaneously with this the interpretation of the Eucharist as meaning, even for the individual, the participation in eternal life, the continuing life of the tribe, or ultimately of humanity. Footnote. There are many indications in literature, in prophetic or poetic form, of this awareness and distinct conviction of an eternal life, reached through love and an inner sense of union with others and with humanity at large, indications which bear the mark of absolute genuineness and sincerity of feeling. See, for instance, Whitman's poem, To the Garden, the World, Leaves of Grass, complete edition, page 79. But an eternal life of the third order, not, thank heaven, an eternity of the meddling and muddling self-conscious intellect. End of footnote. The tribal order rises to humanity. Love ascends from the lingam to yogam, from physical union alone to the union with the whole, which of course includes physical and all other kinds of union. No wonder that the good St. Paul, witnessing that extraordinary whirlpool of beliefs and practices, new and old, there in the 1st century A.D., the unabashed adoration of sex side by side with the transcendental devotions of the Vedic sages and the Gnostics, became somewhat confused himself and even a little violent, scolding his disciples, 1 Corinthians 10:21, for their undiscriminating acceptance, as it seemed to him, of things utterly alien and antagonistic. Quote, "Ye cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of devils. Ye cannot be partakers of the Lord's table and the table of devils." End quote. Every careful reader has noticed the confusedness of Paul's mind and arguments, even taking only those epistles, Galatians, Romans, and Corinthians, which the critics assign to his pen. The thing is observable, and some learned Germans even speak of 2 Pauls. Footnote. Die Mysterien-Anschauung, die bei Paulus im Hintergrunde stehen, drangen sich in dem sogenannten Deuter-Paulinismus mächtig vor. Reitzenstein. End of footnote. But also the thing is quite natural. There can be little doubt that Paul of Tarsus, a Jew brought up in the strictest sect of the Pharisees, did at some time fall deeply under the influence of Greek thought, and quite possibly become an initiate in the mysteries. It would be difficult otherwise to account for his constant use of the mystery language. Reitzenstein says, quote, "The Hellenistic religious literature must have been read by him. He uses its terms and is saturated with its thoughts." See Romans 6:1-14. End quote. And this, conjoined with his Jewish experience, gave him creative power. Quote, "A great deal in his sentiment and thought may have remained Jewish, but to his Hellenism he was indebted for his love of freedom and his firm belief in his apostleship." End quote. He adopts terms like Greek psychikos, eukikos, and pneumatikos, which were in use among the Hellenistic sects of the time. And he writes, as in Romans 6:4-5, about being buried with Christ or planted in the likeness of his death, in words which might well have been used with change of the name by a follower of Attis or Osiris after witnessing the corresponding mysteries. Certainly the allusion to these ancient deities would have been understood by every religionist of that day. These few points are sufficient to accentuate the 2 elements in Paul, the Jewish and the Greek, and to explain, so far, the seeming confusion in his utterances. Further, it is interesting to note, as showing the pagan influences in the New Testament writings, the degree to which the epistle to Philemon, ascribed to Paul, is full, short as it is, of expressions like prisoner of the Lord, fellow soldier, captive, or bondman, which were so common at the time as to be almost a cant in Mithraism and the allied cults. In 1 Peter 2:2 we have the verse, quote, "As newborn babes desire ye the sincere milk of the word, that ye may grow thereby." End quote. And again we may say that no one in that day could mistake the reference herein contained to old initiation ceremonies and the new birth, as described in chapter 8 above, for indeed milk was the well-known diet of the novice in the Isis mysteries, as well as on some savage tribes, of the medicine man when practicing his calling. And here too democracy comes in, strangely foreboded from the first in all this matter. Not only does the third stage bring illumination, intuitive understanding of processes in nature and humanity, sympathy with the animals, artistic capacity, and so forth, but it necessarily brings a new order of society. A preposterous, one may almost say a hideous, social age is surely drawing to its end. The debacle we are witnessing today all over Europe, including the British Islands, the break-up of old institutions, the generally materialistic outlook on life, the coming to the surface of huge masses of diseased and fatuous populations, the scum and dregs created by the past order, all point to the end of a dispensation. Protestantism and commercialism in the two fields of religion and daily life have, as I've indicated before, been occupied in concentrating the mind of each man solely on his own welfare, the salvation of his own soul or body. These two forces have therefore been disruptive to the last degree. They mark the culmination of the self-conscious age, a culmination in war, greed, materialism, and the general principle of devil take the hindmost, and the clearing of the ground for the new order which is to come. So there's hope for the human race. Its evolution is not all a mere formless craze and jumble. There is an inner necessity by which humanity unfolds from one degree or plane of consciousness to another, and if there has been a great fall or lapse into conflict and disease and sin and misery occupying the major part of the historical period hitherto, we shall see that this period is only brief, so to speak, in comparison with the whole curve of growth and expansion. We also see that, as I've said before, the belief in a state of salvation or deliverance has, in the past ages, never left itself quite without a witness in the creeds and rituals and poems and prophecies of mankind. Art, in some form or other, as an activity or inspiration, dating not from the conscious intellect but from deeper regions of subconscious feeling and intuition, has continually come to us as a message from and an evidence of the third stage or state, and as a promise of its more complete realization under other conditions. Through the long night time where the nations wander from Eden past to paradise to be, art's sacred flowers, like fair stars shining yonder, alone, illumine life's obscurity. O gracious artists, out of your deep hearts 'tis some great sun, I doubt, by men unguessed, whose rays come struggling thus in slender darts to shadow what is, till time shall manifest. With the cosmic stage also comes necessarily the rehabilitation of the whole of society in one fellowship, the true democracy, not the rule or domination of one class or caste, as of the intellectual, the pious, the commercial, or the military, but the fusion or at least consentaneous organization of all, as in the corresponding functions of the human body. Class rule has been the mark of that second period of human evolution, and has inevitably given birth during that period to wars and self-aggrandizements of classes and sections, and their consequent greeds and tyrannies over other classes and sections. It is not found in the primitive human tribes and societies, and will not be found in the final forms of human association. The liberated and emancipated man passes unconstrained and unconstraining through all grades and planes of human fellowship, equal and undisturbed, and never leaving his true home and abiding place in the heart of all. Equally necessarily, with the rehabilitation of society as an entirety, will follow the rehabilitation of the entire physical body in each member of society. We have spoken already of nakedness, its meaning and likely extent of adoption, chapter 12. The idea that the head and the hands are the only seemly and presentable members of the organism, and that the other members are unworthy and indecent, is obviously as one-sided and lopsided as that which honors certain classes in the Commonwealth and despises others. Why should the head brag of its ascendancy and domination, and the heart be smothered up and hidden? It will only be a life far more in the open air than that which we lead at present, which will restore the balance and ultimately bring us back to sanity and health. End of section 28. Read by Sandra, near Montreal, 2022.
Chapter 16, Part 1 of Pagan and Christian Creeds, Their Origin and Meaning. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Pagan and Christian Creeds, Their Origin and Meaning by Edward Carpenter, Chapter 16, The Exodus of Christianity. We have dealt with the genesis of Christianity. We now come to the Exodus. For that Christianity can continue to hold the field of religion in the Western world is neither probable nor desirable. It is true, as I have remarked already, that there is a certain trouble about defining what we mean by Christianity, similar to that about the word civilization. If we select out of the great mass of doctrines and rites favored by the various Christian churches just those which commend themselves to the most modern and humane and rational human mind, and choose to call that resulting, but rather small, body of belief and practice Christianity, we are, of course, entitled to do so, and to hope, as we do hope, that this residuum will survive and go forward into the future. But this sort of proceeding is hardly fair and certainly not logical. It enables Christianity to pose as an angel of light, while at the same time keeping discreetly out of sight all of its own abominations and deeds of darkness. The Church, which began its career by destroying, distorting, and denying the pagan sources from which it sprang, whose bishops and other ecclesiastics assassinated each other in their theological rancor of wild beasts, which encouraged the wicked folly of the Crusades, especially the Children's Crusades, and the shameful murders of the Manichaeans, the Albigenses, and the Huguenots, which burned at the stake thousands and thousands of poor witches and heretics, which has hardly ever spoken a generous word in favor or defense of the animals, which in modern times has supported vivisection as against the latter, capitalism and commercialism as against the poorer classes of mankind, and whose priests, in the forms of its various sects, Greek or Catholic, Lutheran or Protestant, have in these last days rushed forth to urge the nations to slaughter each other with every diabolical device of science, and to glorify the war cry of patriotism in defiance of the principle of universal brotherhood. Such a church can hardly claim to have established the angelic character of its mission among mankind. And if it be said, as it often is said, "Oh, but you must go back to the genuine article in the Church's real origin and one foundation in the person and teaching of Jesus Christ," then indeed you come back to the point which this book, as above, enforces, namely, that as to the person of Jesus there is no certainty at all that he ever existed, and as to the teaching credited to him, it is certain that that comes down from a period long anterior to Christianity, and is part of what may justly be called a very ancient world religion. So, as in the case of civilization, we are compelled to see that it is useless to apply the word to some ideal state of affairs or doctrine, an ideal by no means the same in all people's minds or in all localities and times, but that the only reasonable thing to do is to apply it in each case to a historical period. In the case of Christianity, the historical period has lasted nearly 2,000 years, and as I say, we can hardly expect or to wish that it should last much longer. The very thorough and careful investigation of religious origins which has been made during late years by a great number of students and observers undoubtedly tends to show that there has been something like a great world religion coming down the centuries from the remotest times and gradually expanding and branching as it has come. That is to say, that the similarity, in essence, though not always in external detail, between the creeds and rituals of widely sundered tribes and peoples is so great as to justify the view, advanced in the present volume, that these creeds and rituals are the necessary outgrowths of human psychology, slowly evolving, and that consequently they have a common origin, and, in their various forms, a common expression. Of this great world religion, so coming down, Christianity is undoubtedly a branch, and an important branch, but there have been important branches before, and while it may be true that Christianity emphasizes some points which may have been overlooked or neglected in the Vedic teachings, or in Buddhism, or in the Persian and Egyptian and Syrian cults, or in Mohammedanism, and so forth, it is also equally true that Christianity has itself overlooked or neglected valuable points in these religions. It has, in fact, the defects of its qualities. If the world religion is like a great tree, one cannot expect or desire that all its branches should be directed towards the same point of the compass. Reinach, whose studies of religious origins are always interesting and characterized by a certain Gallic grace and nettete, though with a somewhat Jewish non-perception of the mystic element in life, defines religion as a combination of animism and scruples. This is good in a way because it gives the two aspects of the subject, the inner, animism, consisting of the sense of contact with more or less intelligent beings moving in nature, and the outer, consisting in scruples or taboos. The one aspect shows the feeling which inspires religion, the other the checks and limitations which define it and give birth to ritual. But like most anthropologists, he, Reinach, is a little too patronizing towards the poor Indian of untutored mind. He is sorry for people so foolish as to be animistic in their outlook, and he is always careful to point out that the scruples and taboos were quite senseless in their origin, though occasionally, by accident, they turned out useful. Yet, as I have said before, animism is a perfectly sensible, logical, and necessary attitude of the human mind. It is a necessary attribute of man's psychical nature, by which he projects into the great world around him the image of his own mind. When that mind is in a very primitive, inchoate, and fragmentary condition, the images so projected are those of fragmentary intelligences, spirits, gnomes, etc., the age of magic. When the mind rises to distinct consciousness of itself, the reflections of it are anthropomorphic gods. When finally it reaches the universal or cosmic state, it perceives the presence of a universal being behind all phenomena, which being is indeed itself, himself to himself. If you like, you may call the whole process by the name of animism. It is perfectly sensible throughout. The only proviso is that you should also be sensible and distinguish the different stages in the process. Jane Harrison makes considerable efforts to show that religion is primarily a reflection of the social conscious. See Themis, page 482 to 92. That is, that the sense in man of a power that makes for righteousness, outside and also inside him, is derived from his feeling of continuity with the tribe and his instinctive obedience to its behests, confirmed by ages of collective habit and experience. He cannot, in fact, sever the navel string which connects him with his tribal mother, even though he desires to do so. And no doubt this view of the origin of religion is perfectly correct. But it must be pointed out that it does not by any means exclude the view that religion derives also from an animism by which man recognizes, in general nature, his foster mother, and feels himself in closest touch with her. Which may have come first, the social affiliation or the nature of affiliation, I leave to the professors to determine. The term animism may, as far as I can see, be quite well applied to the social affiliation, for the latter is evidently only a case in which the individual projects his own degree of consciousness into the human group around him, instead of into the animals or the trees. But it is a case of which the justice is so obvious that the modern man can intellectually seize and understand it, and consequently he does not tar it with the animistic brush. And Miss Harrison, it must be noticed, does in other passages of the same book, see Themis, pages 68-69, admit that religion has its origin not only from unity with the tribe, but from the sense of affiliation to nature, the sense of, quote, a world of unseen power lying behind the visible universe, a world which is the sphere, it will be seen, of magical activity and the medium of mysticism. The mystical element, the oneness and continuousness, comes out very clearly in the notion of Wakanda among the Sioux Indians. The Omahas regarded all animate and inanimate forms, all phenomena, as pervaded by a common life, which was continuous and similar to the willpower they were conscious of in themselves. This mysterious power in all things they called Wakanda, and through it all things were related to man and to each other in the idea of the continuity of life. A relation was maintained between the seen and the unseen, the dead and the living, and also between the fragment of anything and its entirety. End quote. Thus, our general position is confirmed that religion in its origin has been inspired by a deep instinctive conviction or actual sense of continuity with a being or beings in the world around, while it has derived its form and ritual by slow degrees from a vast number of taboos, generated in the first instance chiefly by superstitious fears, but gradually with the growth of reason and observation becoming simplified and rationalized into forms of use. On the one side there has been the positive impulse of mere animal desire and the animal urge of self-expression. On the other, there has been the negative force of fear based on ignorance, the latter continually carving, molding, and shaping the former. According to this, an organized study and classification of taboos might yield some interesting results because, indeed, it would throw light on the earliest forms of both religion and science. It would be seen that some taboos, like those of contact, say with a menstruous woman or a mother-in-law or a lightning-struck tree, had an obvious basis of observation, justifiable but very crude, while others, like the taboo against harming an enemy who had contracted blood friendship with one of your own tribe, or against giving decent burial to a murderer, were equally rough and rude expressions or indications of the growing moral sentiment of mankind. All the same, there would be left, in any case, a large residuum of taboos which could only be judged as senseless and the mere rubbish of the savage mind. So much for the first origins of the world religion, and I think enough has been said in the various chapters of this book to show that the same general process has obtained throughout. Man, like the animals, began with this deep subconscious sense of unity with surrounding nature. When this became, in man, fairly conscious, it led to magic and totemism, more conscious, and it branched, on the one hand, into figures of gods and definite forms of creeds, on the other into elaborate scientific theories, the latter based on a strong intellectual belief in unity, but fervently denying any anthropomorphic or animistic sense of that unity. Finally, it seems that we are now on the edge of a further stage when the theories and the creeds, scientific and religious, are on the verge of collapsing, but in such a way as to leave the sense and the perception of unity, the real content of the whole process, not only undestroyed, but immensely heightened and illuminated. Meanwhile, the taboos, of which there remain some still, both religious and scientific, have been gradually breaking up and merging themselves into a reasonable and humane order of life and philosophy. I have said that out of this world religion, Christianity really sprang. It is evident that the time has arrived when we must either acknowledge its source, and frankly endeavor to affiliate itself to the same, or failing that must perish. In the first case, it will probably have to change its name. In the second, the question of its name will interest it no more. With regard to the first of these alternatives, I might venture, though with indifference, to make a few suggestions. Why should we not have, instead of a holy Roman Church, a holy human church, rehabilitating the ancient symbols and rituals, a Christianity, if you still desire to call it so, frankly and gladly acknowledging its own sources? This seems a reasonable and even feasible proposition. If such a church wished to celebrate a Mass or Communion or Eucharist, it would have a great variety of rites and customs of that kind to select from. Those that were not appropriate for use in our times, or were connected with the worship of strange gods, need not be rejected or condemned, but could still be commented on and explained as approaches to the same idea, the idea of dedication to the common life, and of reinvigoration of the partaking of it. If the Church wished to celebrate the crucifixion or betrayal of its founder, 100 instances of such celebrations would be to hand, and still the thought that has underlain such celebrations since the beginning of the world could easily be disentangled and presented in concrete form anew. In the light of such teaching, expressions like, "I know that my Redeemer liveth," would be traced to their origin, and men would understand that notwithstanding the mass of rubbish, cant, and humbug which has collected round them, they really do mean something, and represent the age-long instinct of humanity feeling its way towards a more extended revelation, a new order of being, a third stage of consciousness and illumination. In such a church or religious organization, every quality of human nature would have to be represented, every practice and custom allowed for, and its place accorded, the magical and astronomical meanings, the rites connected with sun worship or with sex, or with the worship of animals, the consecration of corn and wine and other products of the ground, initiations, sacrifices, and so forth. All, if indeed it claimed to be a world religion, would have to be represented and recognized, for they will have their long human origin and descent in and through the pagan creeds, and they all have penetrated into and become embodied to some degree in Christianity. Christianity, therefore, as I say, must either now come frankly forward and, acknowledging its parentage from the great order of the past, seek to rehabilitate that and carry mankind one step forward in the path of evolution, or else it must perish. There is no other alternative. Footnote: Comte, in founding his philosophy of positivism, seems to have had in view some such holy human church, but he succeeded in making it all so profoundly dull that it never flourished. The seed of life was not in it. End footnote. End of chapter 16, part 1. Chapter 16, part 2 of Pagan and Christian Creeds, Their Origin and Meaning. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Pagan and Christian Creeds, Their Origin and Meaning, by Edward Carpenter. Chapter 16, Part 2. The Exodus of Christianity. Let me give an instance of how a fragment of ancient ritual which has survived from the far past and is still celebrated, but with little intelligence or understanding, in the Catholic Church of today, might be adopted in such a church as I have spoken of, interpreted, and made eloquent of meaning to modern humanity. When I was in Ceylon nearly 30 years ago, I was fortunate enough to witness a night festival in a Hindu temple, the great festival of Thaipusam, which takes place every year in January. Of course, it was full moon, and great was the blowing up of trumpets in the huge courtyard of the temple. The moon shone down above from among the fronds of tall cocoa palms on a dense crowd of native worshippers, men and a few women, the men for the most part clad in little more than a loincloth, the women picturesque in their colored saris and jeweled ear and nose rings. The images of Siva and 2 other gods were carried in procession around and round the temple. 3 or 4 times nautch girls danced before the images, musicians blowing horns and huge shells, or piping on flageolets, or beating tom-toms accompanied them, the crowd carrying torches or high crates with flaming coconuts walked, or rather danced, along on each side, elated and excited with the sense of the present divinity, yet pleasantly free from any abject awe. The whole thing indeed reminded one of some bas-relief of a bacchanalian procession carved on a Greek sarcophagus, and especially so in its hilarity and suggestion of friendly intimacy with the god. There were singing of hymns and the floating of the chief actors on a raft round a sacred lake. And then came the final act. Siva, or his image, very weighty and borne on the shoulders of strong men, was carried into the first chamber or hall of the temple and placed on an altar with a curtain hanging in front. The crowd followed with a rush, and then there was more music, recital of hymns, and reading from sacred books. From where we stood, we could see the rite which was performed behind the curtain. 2 5-branched candlesticks were lighted, and the manner of their lighting was as follows. Each branch ended in a little cup, and in the cups 5 pieces of camphor were placed, all approximately equal in size. After offerings had been made of fruit, flowers, and sandalwood, 5 camphors in each candlestick were lighted. As the camphor flames burned out, the music became more wild and exciting, and then, at the moment of their extinction, the curtains were drawn aside, and the congregation outside suddenly beheld the god revealed and in a blaze of light. This burning of camphor was, like other things in the service, emblematic. The 5 lights represent the 5 senses. Just as camphor consumes itself and leaves no residue behind, so should the 5 senses, being offered to the god, consume themselves and disappear. When this is done, that happens in the soul which is now figured in the ritual. The god is revealed in the inner light. We are familiar with this parting or rending of the veil. We hear of it in the Jewish temple and in the Greek and Egyptian mysteries. It had a mystically religious and also obviously sexual signification. It occurs here and there in the Roman Catholic ritual. In Spain, some ancient Catholic ceremonials are kept up with a brilliance and splendor hardly found elsewhere in Europe. In the cathedral at Seville, the service of the Passion, carried out on Good Friday with great solemnity and accompanied with fine music, culminates on the Saturday morning, i.e., in the interval between the crucifixion and the resurrection, in a spectacle similar to that described in Ceylon. A rich velvet black curtain hangs before the high altar. At the appropriate moment, and as the very emotional strains of voices and instruments reach their climax in the Gloria in Excelsis, the curtain, with a sudden burst of sound, thunder and the ringing of all the bells, is rent asunder, and the crucified Jesus is seen hanging there, revealed in a halo of glory. There is also held at Seville Cathedral and before the high altar every year the very curious dance of the sixes, performed now by 16 instead of, as of old, by 12 boys, quaintly dressed. It seems to be a survival of some very ancient ritual, probably astronomical, in which the 2 sets of 6 represent the signs of the zodiac, and is celebrated during the festivals of Corpus Christi, the Immaculate Conception, and the Carnival. Numerous instances might, of course, be adduced of how a church aspiring to be a real church of humanity might adopt and recreate the rituals of the past in the light of a modern inspiration. Indeed, the difficulty would be to limit the process, for every ancient ritual we can now see has had a meaning and a message and it would be a real joy to disentangle these and to expose the profound solidarity of humanity and aspiration from the very dawn of civilization down to the present day. Nor would it be necessary to imagine any act of uniformity or dead level of ceremonial in the matter. Different groups might concentrate on different phases of religious thought and practice. The only necessity would be that they should approach the subject with a real love of humanity in their hearts and a real desire to come into touch with the deep inner life and mystic growing pains of the souls of men and women in all ages. In this direction, M. Loisy has done noble and excellent work, but the dead weight and selfish blinkerdom of the Catholic organization has hampered him to that degree that he has been unable to get justice done to his liberalizing designs, or perhaps even to reveal the full extent of them. And the same difficulty will remain. On the one hand, no spiritual movement which does not take up the attitude of a world religion has now in this age any chance of success. On the other, all the existing churches, whether Roman Catholic or Greek or Protestant or secularist, whether Christian or Jewish or Persian or Hindu, will in all probability adopt the same blind and blinkered and selfish attitude as that described above, and so disqualify themselves for the great role of worldwide emancipation, which some religion at some time will certainly have to play. It is the same difficulty which is looming large in modern world politics, where the local selfishness and vainglorious patriotisms of the nations are sadly impeding and obstructing the development of that sense of internationalism and brotherhood which is the clearly indicated form of the future, and which alone can give each nation deliverance from fear and a promise of growth and the confident assurance of power. I say that Christianity must either frankly adopt this generous attitude and confess itself a branch of the great world religion, anxious only to do honor to its source, or else it must perish and pass away. There is no other alternative. The hour of its exodus has come. It may be, of course, that neither the Christian Church nor any branch of it nor any other religious organization will step into the gap. It may be, but I do not think this is likely, that the time of rites and ceremonies and formal creeds is past, and churches of any kind will be no more needed in the world. Not likely, I say, because of the still far backwardness of the human masses, and their considerable dependence yet on laws and forms and rituals. Still, if it should prove that that age of dependence is really approaching its end, that would surely be a matter for congratulation. It would mean that mankind was moving into a knowledge of the reality which has underlain these outer shows, that it was coming to the third stage of its consciousness. Having found this, there would be no need for it to dwell any longer in the land of superstitions and formulae. It would have come to the place of which these latter are only the outlying indications. It may therefore happen, and this quite independently of the growth of a world cult, such as I have described, though by no means in antagonism to it, that a religious philosophy or theosophy might develop and spread, similar to the nonam of the Hindus or the nomis of the pre-Christian sects, which would become, first among individuals and afterwards among large bodies over the world, the religion of, or perhaps one should say the religious approach to the third state. Books like the Upanishads and the Vedic seers and the Bhagavad Gita, though garbled and obscured by priestly interferences and mystifications, do undoubtedly represent and give expression to the highest utterance of religious experience to be found anywhere in the world. They are indeed the manuals of human entrance into the cosmic state. But as I say, and as has happened in the case of other sacred books, a vast deal of rubbish has accreted round their essential teachings, and has to be cleared away. To go into a serious explication of the meaning of these books would be far too large an affair, and would be foreign to the purpose of the present volume. But I have in the appendix below inserted 2 papers on rest and the nature of the self, containing the substance of lectures given on the above books. These papers or lectures are couched in the very simplest language, free from Sanskrit terms and the usual jargon of the schools, and may, I hope, even on that account, be of use in familiarizing readers who are not specially students with the ideas and mental attitudes of the cosmic state. Non-differentiation, Advaita, is the root attitude of the mind inculcated. Footnote: the word means not-to-ness. Here we see a great subtlety of definition. It is not to be one with others that is urged, but to be not to. End footnote. We have seen that there has been an age of non-differentiation in the past, non-differentiation from other members of the tribe, from the animals, from nature, and the spirit or spirits of nature. Why should there not arise a similar sense of non-differentiation in the future? Similar but more extended, more intelligent. Certainly, this will arrive in its own appointed time. There will be a surpassing of the bounds of separation and division. There will be a surpassing of all taboos. We have seen the use and function of taboos in the early stages of evolution, and how progress and growth have been very much a matter of their gradual extinction and assimilation into the general body of rational thought and feeling. Unreasoning and idiotic taboos still linger, but they grow weaker. A new morality will come which will shake itself free from them. The sense of kinship with the animals, as in the old rituals, will be restored. The sense of kinship in all the races of mankind will grow and become consolidated. The sense of the defilement and impurity of the human body will, with the adoption of a generally clean and wholesome life, pass away, and the body itself will come to be regarded more as a collection of shrines in which the gods may be worshipped, and less as a mere organ of trivial self-gratifications. There will be no form of nature, or of human life, or of the lesser creatures, which will be barred from the approach of man, or from the intimate and penetrating invasion of his spirit. And as in certain ceremonies, and after honorable toils and labors, a citizen is sometimes received into the community of his own city, so the emancipated human being, on the completion of his long pilgrimage on earth, will be presented with the freedom of the universe. End of chapter 16, part 2.
Chapter 17 of Pagan and Christian Creeds, Their Origin and Meaning. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Pagan and Christian Creeds, Their Origin and Meaning by Edward Carpenter. Conclusion. In conclusion, there does not seem much to say, except to accentuate certain points which may still appear doubtful or capable of being understood. The fact that the main argument of this volume is among the lines of psychological evolution will no doubt commend it to some, while on the other hand it will discredit the book to others whose eyes, being fixed on purely material causes, can see no impetus in history except through these. But it must be remembered that there is not the least reason for separating the two factors. The fact that psychologically man has evolved from simple consciousness to self-consciousness, and is now in process of evolution towards another and more extended kind of consciousness, does not in the least bar the simultaneous appearance and influence of material evolution. It is clear indeed that the two must largely go together, acting and reacting on each other. Whatever the physical conditions of the animal brain may be which connect themselves with simple, unreflected and unreflecting consciousness, it is evident that these conditions, in animals and primitive man, lasted for an enormous period, before the distinct consciousness of the individual and separate self arose. This second order of consciousness seems to have germinated at or about the same period as the discovery of the use of tools of stone, copper, bronze, etc., the adoption of picture writing, and the use of reflective words like I and thou, and it led on to the appreciation of gold and of iron with their ornamental and practical values, the accumulation of property, the establishment of slavery of various kinds, the subjection of women, the encouragement of luxury and self-indulgence, the growth of crowded cities, and the endless conflicts and wars so resulting. We can see plainly that the incoming of the self-motive exercised a direct stimulus on the pursuit of these material objects and adaptations, and that the material adaptations in their turn did largely accentuate the self-motive. But to insist that the real explanation of the whole process is only to be found along one channel, the material or the psychical, is clearly quite unnecessary. Those who understand that all matter is conscious in some degree, and that all consciousness has a material form of some kind, will be the first to admit this. The same remarks apply to the third stage. We can see that in modern times the huge and unlimited powers of production by machinery, united with growing tendency towards intelligent birth control, are preparing the way for an age of communism and communal plenty which will inevitably be associated, partly as cause and partly as effect, with a new general phase of consciousness, involving the mitigation of the struggle for existence, the growth of intuitional and psychical perception, the spread of amity and solidarity, the disappearance of war, and the realization in degree of the cosmic life. Perhaps the greatest difficulty or stumbling block to the general acceptance of the belief in a third or golden age phase of human evolution is the obstinate and obdurate prejudgment that the passing of humanity out of the second stage can only mean the entire abandonment of self-consciousness. And this, people say, and quite rightly, is both impossible and undesirable. Throughout the preceding chapters I have striven, wherever feasible, to counter this misunderstanding, but I have little hope of success. The determination of the world to misunderstand or misinterpret anything a little new or unfamiliar is a thing which perhaps only an author can duly appreciate. But while it is clear that self-consciousness originally came into being through a process of alienation and exile and fear which marked it with the Cain-like brand of loneliness and apartness, it is equally clear that to think of that apartness as an absolute and permanent separation is an illusion, since no being can really continue to live divorced from the source of its life. For a period in evolution, the self took on this elusive form in consciousness as of an ignis fatuus, the form of a being sundered from all other beings, atomic, lonely, without refuge, surrounded by dangers and struggling for itself alone and for its own salvation in the midst of a hostile environment. Perhaps some such terrible imagination was necessary at first, as it were, to start humanity on its new path, but it had its compensation for the sufferings and tortures, mental and bodily, the privations, persecutions, accusations, hatreds, the wars and conflicts so endured by millions of individuals and whole races, have at length stamped upon the human mind a sense of individual responsibility which otherwise perhaps would never have emerged, and whose mark can now be effaced. Ultimately, too, these things have searched our inner nature to its very depths and exposed its bedrock foundation. They have convinced us that this idea of ultimate separation is an illusion, and that in truth we are all indefeasible and indestructible parts of one great unity in which we live and move and have our being. That being so, it is clear that there remains in the end a self-consciousness which need by no means be abandoned, which indeed only comes to its true fruition and understanding when it recognizes its affiliation with the whole, and glories in an individuality which is an expression both of itself and of the whole. The human child at its mother's knee probably comes first to know it has a self on some fateful day, when having wandered afar it goes lost among alien houses and streets or in the trackless fields. That appalling experience, the sense of danger, of fear, of loneliness, is never forgotten. It stamps some new sense of being upon the childish mind. But that sense, instead of being destroyed, becomes all the prouder and more radiant in the hour of return to the mother's arms. The return, the salvation for which humanity looks, is the return of the little individual self to harmony and union with the great self of the universe, but by no means its extinction or abandonment, rather the finding of its own true nature as never before. There is another thing which may be said here, namely, that the disentanglement as above of three main stages of psychological evolution as great formative influences in the history of mankind does not by any means preclude the establishment of lesser stages within the boundaries of these. In all probability, subdivisions of all the three will come in time to be recognized and allowed for. To take the second stage only, it may appear that self-consciousness in its first development is characterized by an accentuation of timidity, in its second development by a more deliberate pursuit of sensual pleasure, lust, food, drink, etc., in its third by the pursuit of mental gratifications, vanities, ambitions, enslavement of others, in its fourth by the pursuit of property as a means of attaining these objects, in its fifth by the access of enmities, jealousies, wars, and so forth, consequent on all these things, and so on. I have no intention at present of following out this line of thought, but only wish to suggest its feasibility and the degree to which it may throw light on the social evolutions of the past. As a kind of rude general philosophy, we may say that there are only two main factors in life, namely, love and ignorance. And of these we may also say that the two are not in the same plane. One is positive and substantial, the other is negative and merely illusory. It may be thought at first that fear and hatred and cruelty and the like are very positive things, but in the end we see that they are due merely to absence of perception, to dullness of understanding. Or we may put the statement in a rather less crude form and say that there are only two factors in life: one, the sense of unity with others and with nature, which covers love, faith, courage, truth, and so forth, and two, non-perception of the same, which covers enmity, fear, hatred, self-pity, cruelty, jealousy, meanness, and an endless similar list. The present world which we see around us, with its idiotic wars, its senseless jealousies of nations and classes, its fears and greeds and vanities, and its futile endeavors as of people struggling in a swamp to find one's own salvation by treading others underfoot, is a negative phenomenon. Ignorance, non-perception are at the root of it, but it is the blessed virtue of ignorance and of non-perception that they inevitably, if only slowly and painfully, destroy themselves. All experience serves to dissipate them. The world, as it is, carries the doom of its own transformation in its bosom, and in proportion as that which is negative disappears, the positive element must establish itself more and more. So we come back to that with which we began, to fear bred by ignorance. From that source has sprung the long catalogue of follies, cruelties, and sufferings which mark the records of the human race since the dawn of history, and to the overcoming of this fear we perforce must look for our future deliverance, and for the discovery even in the midst of this world of our true home. The time is coming when the positive constructive element must dominate, It is inevitable that man must ever build a state of society around him after the pattern and image of his own interior state. The whole futile and idiotic structure of commerce and industry in which we are now imprisoned springs from that falsehood of individualistic self-seeking which marks the second stage of human evolution. That stage is already tottering to its fall, destroyed by the very flood of egotistic passions and interests, of vanities, greeds, and cruelties, all warring with each other, which are the sure outcome and culmination of its operation. With the restoration of the sentiment of the common life, and the gradual growth of a mental attitude corresponding, there will emerge from the flood something like a solid earth, something on which it will be possible to build with good hope for the future. Schemes of reconstruction are well enough in their way, but if there's no ground of real human solidarity beneath, of what avail are they? An industrial system, which is no real industrial order, but only on the part of the employers a devil's device for securing private profit under the guise of public utility, and on the part of the employed a dismal and poor-spirited renunciation, for the sake of a bare living, of all real interests in life and work. Such a system must infallibly pass away. It cannot, in the nature of things, be permanent. The first condition of social happiness and prosperity must be the sense of the common life. This sense, which instinctively underlay the whole tribal order of the far past, which first came to consciousness in the worship of 1,000 pagan divinities, and in the rituals of countless sacrifices, initiations, redemptions, love feasts, and communions, which inspired the dreams of the Golden Age, and flashed out for a time in the communism of the early Christians, and in their adorations of the risen Saviour, must in the end be the creative condition of a new order. It must provide the material of which the Golden City waits to be built. The long travail of the world religion will not have been in vain, which assures this consummation. What the signs and conditions of any general advance into this new order of life and consciousness will be, we know not. It may be that, as to individuals, the revelation of a new vision often comes quite suddenly, and generally, perhaps, after a period of great suffering. So to society at large a similar revelation will arrive, like the lightning which cometh out of the east, and shineth even unto the west, with unexpected swiftness. On the other hand, it would perhaps be wise not to count too much on any such sudden transformation. When we look abroad and at home in this year of grace and hoped-for peace, 1919, and see the spirits of rancor and revenge, the fears, the selfish blindness and the ignorance which still hold in their paralyzing grasp huge classes and coteries in every country in the world, we see that the second stage of human development is by no means yet at its full term, and that, as in some vast chrysalis, for the liberation of the creature within still more and more terrible struggles may be necessary. We can only pray that such may not be the case. Anyhow, if we have followed the argument of this book, we can hardly doubt that the destruction which is going on everywhere of the outer form of the present society marks the first stage of man's final liberation, and that sooner or later, and in its own good time, that further divine event will surely be realized. Nor need we fear that humanity, when it has once entered into the great deliverance, will be again overpowered by evil. From knowledge back to ignorance there is no complete return. The nations that have come to enlightenment need entertain no dread of those others, however hostile they appear, who are still plunging darkly in the troubled waters of self-greed. The dastardly fears which inspire all brutishness and cruelty of warfare, whether of white against white, or it may be of white against yellow or black, may be dismissed for good, and all by that blessed race which once shall have gained the shore, since from the very nature of the case those who are on dry land can fear nothing, and need fear nothing from the unfortunates who are yet tossing in the welter and turmoil of the waves. Dr. Fraser, in the conclusion of his great work, The Golden Bough, bids farewell to his readers with the following words, quote, "The laws of nature are merely hypotheses devised to explain that ever-shifting phantasmagoria of thought, which we dignify with the high-sounding names of the world and the universe. In the last analysis, magic, religion, and science are nothing but theories of thought, and as science has supplanted its predecessors, so it may hereafter itself be superseded by some more perfect hypothesis, perhaps by some perfectly different way of looking at phenomena, of registering the shadows on the screen, of which we in this generation can form no idea." End quote. I imagine Dr. Fraser is right in thinking that a way of looking at phenomena different from the way of science may some day prevail, but I think this change will come not so much by the growth of science itself or the extension of its hypotheses, as by a growth and expansion of the human heart, and a change in its psychology and powers of perception. Perhaps some of the preceding chapters will help to show how much the outlook of humanity on the world has been guided through the centuries by the slow evolution of its inner consciousness. Gradually, out of an infinite mass of folly and delusion, the human soul has in this way disentangled itself, and will in the future disentangle itself, to emerge at length in the light of true freedom. All the taboos, the insane terrors, the fatuous forbiddals of this and that, with their consequent heart-searchings and distress, may perhaps have been in their way necessary, in order to rivet and define the meaning and the understanding of that word. Today, these taboos and terrors still linger, many of them, in the form of conventions of morality, uneasy strivings of conscience, doubts and desperations of religion. But ultimately man will emerge from all these free, familiar, that is, with them all, making use of all, allowing generously for the values of all, but hampered and bound by none. He will realize the inner meaning of the creeds and rituals of the ancient religions, and will hail with joy the fulfillment of their far prophecy down the ages, finding after all the long-expected Saviour of the world within his own breast, and paradise in the disclosure there of the everlasting peace of the soul. End of section 31, read by Sandra in Nova Scotia, 2022. Appendix Part 1 of Pagan and Christian Creeds, Their Origin and Meaning. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Pagan and Christian Creeds, Their Origin and Meaning by Edward Carpenter. Appendix, The Teaching of the Upanishads, Part 1, being the substance of 2 lectures to popular audiences. 1. Rest. To some, in the present whirlpool of life and affairs, it may seem almost an absurdity to talk about rest. For long enough now, rest has seemed a thing far off and unattainable. With the posts knocking at our doors 10 or 12 times a day, with telegrams arriving every hour, and the telephone bell constantly ringing, with motors rushing wildly about the streets and aeroplanes whizzing overhead, with work speeded up in every direction and the drive in the workshops becoming more intolerable every day, with the pace of the walkers and the pace of the talkers from hour to hour insanely increasing, what room, it may well be asked, is there for rest? And now the issues of war, redoubling the urgency of all questions, are on us. The problem is obviously a serious one. So urgent is it that I think one may safely say the amount of insanity due to the pressure of daily life is increasing. Nursing homes have sprung up for the special purpose of treating such cases, and doctors are starting special courses of tuition in the art, now becoming very important, of systematically doing nothing. And yet it is difficult to see the outcome of it all. The clock of what is called progress is not easily turned backward. We should not very readily agree nowadays to the abolition of telegrams or to a regulation compelling express trains to stop at every station. We can't all go to nursing homes or afford to enjoy a winter's rest cure in Egypt. And if not, is the speeding up process to go on indefinitely, incapable of being checked and destined ultimately to land civilization in the madhouse? It is, I say, a serious and an urgent problem, and it is, I think, forcing a certain answer on us, which I will now endeavor to explain. If we cannot turn back and reverse this fatal onrush of modern life, and it is evident that we cannot do so in any very brief time, though of course ultimately we might succeed, then I think there are clearly only 2 alternatives left, either to go forward to general dislocation and madness, or to learn to rest, even in the very midst of the hurry and the scurry. To explain what I mean, let me use an illustration. The typhoons and cyclones of the China Seas are some of the most formidable storms that ships can encounter. Their paths in the past have been strewn with wrecks and disaster. But now, with increased knowledge, much of their danger has been averted. It is known that they are circular in character, and that though the wind on their outskirts often reaches a speed of 100 miles an hour, in the center of the storm there's a space of complete calm. Not a calm of the sea, certainly, but a complete absence of wind. The skilled navigator, if he cannot escape the storm, steers right into the heart of it and rests there. Even in the midst of the clatter he finds a place of quiet where he can trim his sails and adjust his future course. He knows, too, from his position in what direction, at every point around him, the wind is moving, and where it will strike him when at last his ship emerges from the charmed circle. Is it not possible, we may ask, that in the very midst of the cyclone of daily life we may find a similar resting place? If we can, our case is by no means hopeless. If we cannot, then indeed there is danger. Looking back in history, we seem to see that in old times people took life much more leisurely than they do now. The elder generations gave more scope in their customs and their religions for contentment and peace of mind. We associate a certain quietism and passivity with the thought of the Eastern peoples, but as civilization traveled westward, external activity and the pace of life increased. Less and less time was left for meditation and repose, till with the rise of Western Europe and America, the dominant note of life seems to have simply become one of feverish and ceaseless activity, of activity merely for the sake of activity, without any clear idea of its own purpose or object. Such a prospect does not at first seem very hopeful, but on second thoughts we see that we are not forced to draw any very pessimistic conclusion from it. The direction of human evolution need not remain always the same. The movement, in fact, of civilization from east to west has now clearly completed itself. The globe has been circled, and we cannot go any farther to the west without coming round to the east again. It is a commonplace to say that our psychology, our philosophy, and our religious sense are already taking on an Eastern color, nor is it difficult to imagine that with the end of the present dispensation, a new era may perfectly naturally arrive in which the St. Vitus dance of money-making and ambition will cease to be the chief end of existence. In the history of nations, as in the history of individuals, there are periods when the formative ideals of life, through some hidden influence, change, and the mode of life and evolution in consequence changes also. I remember when I was a boy wishing, like many other boys, to go to sea. I wanted to join the Navy. It was not, I'm sure, that I was so very anxious to defend my country. No, there was a much simpler and more prosaic motive than that. The ships of those days with their complex rigging suggested a perfect paradise of climbing, and I know that it was the thought of that which influenced me. To be able to climb indefinitely among those ropes and spars, how delightful! Of course I knew perfectly well that I should not always have free access to the rigging, but then some day, no doubt, I should be an admiral, and who then could prevent me? I remember seeing myself in my mind's eye, with cocked hat on my head and spyglass under my arm, roaming at my own sweet will up aloft, regardless of the remonstrances which might reach me from below. Such was my childish ideal. But a time came, needless to say, when I conceived a different idea of the object of life. It is said that John Tyndall, whose lectures on science were so much sought after in their time, being on one occasion in New York, was accosted after his discourse by a very successful American businessman who urged him to devote his scientific knowledge and ability to commercial pursuits, promising that if he did so, he, Tyndall, would easily make a big pile. Tyndall very calmly replied, "Well, I myself thought of that once, but I soon abandoned the idea, having come to the conclusion that I had no time to waste in making money." The man of dollars nearly sank into the ground. Such a conception of life had never entered his head before. But to Tyndall, no doubt, it was obvious that if he chained himself to the commercial ideal, all the joy and glory of his days would be gone. We sometimes hear of the awful doom of some of the Russian convicts in the quarries and mines of Siberia, who are or were chained permanently to their wheelbarrows. It is difficult to imagine a more dreadful fate. The despair, the disgust, the deadly loathing of the accursed thing from which there is no escape day or night, which is the companion not only of the prisoner's work, but of his hours of rest, with which he has to sleep, to feed, to take his recreation if he has any, and to fulfill all the offices of nature. Could anything be more crushing? And yet, is it not true that we, most of us, in our various ways, are chained to our wheelbarrows? Is it not too often true that to these beggarly things we have for the most part chained ourselves? Let me be understood. Of course we all have or ought to have our work to do. We have our living to get, our families to support, our trade, our art, our profession to pursue. In that sense, no doubt, we are tied. But I take it that these things are like the wheelbarrow which a man uses while he's at work. It may irk him at times, but he sticks to it with a good heart and with a certain joy, because it is the instrument of a noble purpose. That is all right. But to be chained to it, not to be able to leave it when the work of the day is done, that is indeed an ignoble slavery. I would say, then, take care that even with these things, these necessary arts of life, you preserve your independence, that even if to some degree they may confine your body, they do not enslave your mind. For it is the freedom of the mind which counts. We are all, no doubt, caught in the toils of the earth life. One man is largely dominated by sensual indulgence, another by ambition, another by the pursuit of money. Well, these things are all right in themselves. Without the pleasures of the senses we should be dull mokes indeed. Without ambition much of the zest and enterprise of life would be gone. Gold, in the present order of affairs, is a very useful servant. These things are right enough, but to be chained to them, to be unable to think of anything else, what a fate! The subject reminds one of a not uncommon spectacle. It's a glorious day. The sun is bright. Small white clouds float in the transparent blue. A day when you linger, perforce, on the road to enjoy the scene. But suddenly here comes a man painfully running, all hot and dusty and mopping his head, and with no eye clearly for anything around him. What is the matter? He's absorbed by one idea. He's running to catch a train. And one cannot help wondering what exceedingly important business it must be, for which all this glory and beauty is sacrificed and passed by as if it did not exist. Further, we must remember that in our foolishness we very commonly chain ourselves not only to things like sense pleasures and ambitions which are on the edge, so to speak, of being vices, but also to other things which are accounted virtues, and which, as far as I can see, are just as bad, if we once become enslaved to them. I've known people who were so exceedingly spiritual and good that one really felt quite depressed in their company. I have known others whose sense of duty, dear things, was so strong that they seemed quite unable to rest, or even to allow their friends to rest, and I have wondered whether, after all, worriting about one's duty might not be as bad, as deteriorating to oneself, as distressing to one's friends, as sinning a good solid sin. No, in this respect virtues may be no better than vices, and to be chained to a wheelbarrow made of alabaster is no way preferable to being chained to one of wood. To sacrifice the immortal freedom of the mind in order to become a prey to self-regarding cares and anxieties, self-estimating virtues and vices, self-chaining duties and indulgences is a mistake. And I warn you, it is quite useless, for the destiny of freedom is ultimately upon everyone, and if refusing it for a time, you heap your life persistently upon one object, however blameless in itself that object may be, beware, for one day, and when you least expect it, the gods will send a thunderbolt upon you. One day the thing for which you have toiled and spent laborious days and sleepless nights will lie broken before you. Your reputation will be ruined, your ambition will be dashed, your savings of years will be lost, and for the moment you will be inclined to think that your life has been in vain. But presently you will wake up and find that something quite different has happened. You will find that the thunderbolt which you thought was your ruin has been your salvation, that it has broken the chain which bound you to your wheelbarrow, and that you are free. I think you will now see what I mean by rest. Rest is the loosing of the chains which bind us to the whirligig of the world. It is the passing into the center of the cyclone. It is the stilling of thought. For with regard to this last, it is thought, it is the attachment of the mind which binds us to outer things. The outer things themselves are all right. It's only through our thoughts that they make slaves of us. Obtain power over your thoughts and you're free. You can then use the outer things or dismiss them at your pleasure. There is nothing new, of course, in all this. It's been known for ages and is part of the ancient philosophy of the world. In the Katha Upanishad, you will find these words, Max Muller's translation, quote, "As rainwater that has fallen on a mountain ridge runs down all sides, thus does he who sees a difference between qualities run after them on all sides." End quote. This is the figure of the man who does not rest, and it is a powerful likeness. The thunder shower descends on the mountain top. Torrents of water pour down the crags in every direction. Imagine the state of mind of a man, however thirsty he may be, who endeavors to pursue and intercept all these streams. But then the Upanishad goes on, quote, "As pure water poured into pure water remains the same, thus, O Gautama, is the self of a thinker who knows." End quote. What a perfect image of rest! Imagine a cistern before you with transparent glass sides and filled with pure water. And then imagine someone comes with a phial, also of pure water, and pours the contents gently into the cistern. What will happen? Almost nothing. The pure water will glide into the pure water, remaining the same. There will be no dislocation, no discoloration, as might happen if muddy water were poured in. There will be only perfect harmony. I imagine here that the meaning is something like this. The cistern is the great reservoir of the universe which contains the pure and perfect spirit of all life. Each one of us and every mortal creature represents a drop from that reservoir, a drop indeed which is also pure and perfect, though the phial in which it is contained may not always be so. When we, each of us, descend into the world and meet the great ocean of life which dwells there behind all mortal forms, it is like the little phial being poured into the great reservoir. If the tiny canful, which is ourselves, is pure and unsoiled, then when it meets the world it will blend with the spirit which informs the world perfectly harmoniously, without distress or dislocation. It will pass through and be at one with it. How can one describe such a state of affairs? You will have the key to every person that you meet, because indeed you are conscious that the real essence of that person is the same as your own. You will have the solution of every event which happens, for every event is and is felt to be the touch of the Great Spirit on yours. Can any description of rest be more perfect than that? Pure water poured into pure water. There is no need to hurry, for everything will come in its good time. There is no need to leave your place, for all you desire is close at hand. Here is another verse from the Vagasaneyi Samhita Upanishad, embodying the same idea, quote, "And he who beholds all beings in the self, and the self in all beings, he never turns away from it. When, to a man who understands, the self has become all things, what sorrow, what trouble can there be to him, having once beheld that unity?" End quote. What trouble, what sorrow indeed, when the universe has become transparent with the presences of all we love, held firm in the one enfolding presence. But it will be said, quote, "Our minds are not pure and transparent. More often they are muddy and soiled if not in their real essence, yet by reason of the mortal phial in which they are contained." End quote. And that, alas, is true. If you pour a phial of muddy water into that reservoir which we described, what will you see? You will see a queer and ugly cloud formed. And to how many of us in our dealings with the world does life take on just such a form of a queer and ugly cloud? End of section 32. Read by Sandra near Montreal, 2022. Section 33 of Pagan and Christian Creeds, Their Origin and Meaning. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Pagan and Christian Creeds, Their Origin and Meaning by Edward Carpenter. Appendix, Part 2. Now, not so very long after those Upanishads were written, there lived in China that great teacher Lao Tse, and he too had considered these things, and he wrote in the Tao Te King, "Who is there who can make muddy water clear?" The question sounds like a conundrum. For a moment one hesitates to answer it. Lao Tse, however, has an answer ready. He says, "But if you leave it alone, it will become clear of itself." That muddy water of the mind, muddied by all the foolish little thoughts which like a sediment infest it, but if you leave it alone, it will become clear of itself. Sometimes walking along the common road after a shower, you've seen pools of water lying here and there, dirty and unsightly with the mud stirred up by the hoofs of men and animals, and then returning some hours afterwards along the same road, in the evening, and after the cessation of traffic, you've looked again, and lo, each pool has cleared itself to a perfect calm, and has become a lovely mirror reflecting the trees and the clouds and the sunset and the stars. So this mirror of the mind, leave it alone. Let the ugly sediment of tiresome thoughts and anxieties, and of fussing over one's self-importances and duties, settle down, and presently you will look on it and see something there which you never knew or imagined before, something more beautiful than you ever yet beheld. A reflection of the real and eternal world which is only given to the mind that rests. Do not recklessly spill the waters of your mind in this direction and in that, lest you become like a spring lost and dissipated in the desert, but draw them together into a little compass and hold them still, so still, and let them become clear, so limpid, so mirror-like. At last the mountains and the sky shall glass themselves in peaceful beauty, and the antelope shall descend to drink, and the lion to quench his thirst, and Love himself shall come and bend over and catch his own likeness in you. Yes, there is this priceless thing within us, but hoofing along the roads in the mud we fail to find it. There is this region of calm, but the cyclone of the world raging around guards us from entering it. Perhaps it is best so, best that the access to it should not be made too easy. One day, some time ago, in the course of conversation with Rabindranath Tagore in London, I asked him what impressed him most in visiting the great city. He said, "The restless, incessant movement of everybody." I said, "Yes, they seem as if they're all rushing about looking for something." He replied, "It's because each person does not know of the great treasure he has within himself." How then are we to reach this treasure and make it our own? How are we to attain to this stilling of the mind, which is the secret of all power and possession? The thing is difficult, no doubt, yet as I tried to show at the outset of this discourse, we moderns must reach it. We've got to attain to it, for the penalty of failure is and must be widespread madness. The power to still the mind, to be able, mark you, when you want, to enter into the region of rest and to dismiss or command your thoughts, is a condition of health. It's a condition of all power and energy. For all health, whether of mind or body, resides in one's relation to the central life within. If one cannot get into touch with that, then the life forces cannot flow down into the organism. Most, perhaps all disease arises from the disturbance of this connection. All mere hurry, all mere running after external things, as of the man after the water streams on the mountain top, inevitably breaks it. Let a pond be allowed calmly under the influence of frost to crystallize, and most beautiful flowers and spears of ice will be formed. But keep stirring the water all the time with a stick or a pole, and nothing will result but an ugly brash of half-frozen stuff. The condition of the exercise of power and energy is that it should proceed from a center of rest within one. So convinced am I of this, that whenever I find myself hurrying over my work, I pause and say, "Now you are not producing anything good," and I generally find that that is true. It is curious, but I think very noticeable, that the places where people hurry most, as for instance the City of London or Wall Street, New York, are just the places where the work being done is of least importance, being mostly money gambling, whereas if you go and look at a ploughman ploughing, doing perhaps the most important of human work, you find all his movements most deliberate and leisurely, as if indeed he had infinite time at command, the truth being that in dealing like a ploughman with the earth and the horses and the weather and the things of nature, generally you can no more hurry than nature herself hurries. Following this line of thought, it might seem that one would arrive at a hopeless paradox. If it be true that the less one hurries the better the work resulting, then it might seem that by sitting still and merely twirling one's thumbs, one would arrive at the very greatest activity and efficiency. And indeed, if understood aright, there is a truth even in this, which, like the other points I've mentioned, has been known and taught long ages ago. Says that humorous old sage Lao Tzu, whom I've already quoted, "By non-action there is nothing that cannot be done." At first this sounds like mere foolery or worse, but afterwards thinking on it one sees there is a meaning hidden. There is a secret by which nature and the powers of the universal life will do all for you. The Bhagavad Gita also says, "He who discovers inaction in action and action in inaction is wise among mortals." It is worthwhile dwelling for a moment on these texts. We are all, as I said earlier on, involved in work belonging to our place and station. We are tied to some degree in the bonds of action, but that fact need not imprison our inner minds. While acting, even with keenness and energy, along the external and necessary path before us, it is perfectly possible to hold the mind free and untied, so that the result of our action, which of course is not ours to command, shall remain indifferent and incapable of unduly affecting us. Similarly, when it is our part to remain externally inactive, we may discover that underneath this apparent inaction, we may be taking part in the currents of a deeper life, which are moving on to a definite end, to an end or object which in a sense is ours, and in a sense is not ours. The lighthouse beam flies over land and sea with incredible velocity, and you think the light itself must be in swiftest movement. But when you climb up thither, you find the lamp absolutely stationary. It's only the reflection that is moving. The rider on horseback may gallop to and fro wherever he will, but it's hard to say that he is acting. The horse, guided by the slightest indication of the man's will, performs the action that is needed. If we can get into right touch with the immense, the incalculable powers of nature, is there anything which we may not be able to do? If a man worship the self only as his true state, says the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, his work cannot fail, for whatever he desires, that he obtains from the self. What a wonderful saying, and how infallibly true! For obviously, if you succeed in identifying your true being with the great self of the universe, then whatever you desire, the great self will also desire, and therefore every power of nature will be at your service, and will conspire to fulfill your need. There are marvelous things here well wrapped up, difficult to describe, yet not impossible to experience, and they all depend upon that power of stilling thought, that ability to pass unharmed and undismayed through the grinning legions of the lower mind into the very heart of paradise. The question inevitably arises, how can this power be obtained? And there is only one answer, the same answer which has to be given for the attainment of any power or faculty. There is no royal road. The only way is, however imperfectly, to do the thing in question, to practice it. If you would learn to play cricket, the only way is to play cricket. If you would be able to speak a language, the only way is to speak it. If you would learn to swim, the only way is to practice swimming. Or would you wish to be like the man who, when his companions were bathing and bidding him come and join them, said, "Yes, I'm longing to join you, but I'm not going to be such a fool as to go into the water till I know how to swim"? There's nothing but practice. If you want to obtain that priceless power of commanding thought, of using it or dismissing it, for the two things go together at will, there is no way but practice. And the practice consists in two exercises. A, that of concentration, in holding the thought steadily for a time on one subject or point of a subject. And B, that of effacement, in effacing any given thought from the mind and determining not to entertain it for such and such a time. Both these exercises are difficult. Failure in practicing them is certain, and may even extend over years. But the power equally certainly grows with practice, and ultimately there may come a time when the learner is not only able to efface from his mind any given thought, however importunate, but he may even succeed in effacing during short periods all thought of any kind. When this stage is reached, the veil of illusion which surrounds all mortal things is pierced, and the entrance to the paradise of rest and of universal power and knowledge is found. Of indirect or auxiliary methods of reaching this great conclusion, there are more than one. I think of life in the open air, if not absolutely necessary, at least most important. The gods, though sometimes out of compassion they visit the interiors of houses, are not fond of such places, and the evil effluvium they find there, and avoid them as much as they can. It is not merely a question of breathing oxygen instead of carbonic acid. There is a presence and an influence in nature in the open which expands the mind and causes brigand cares and worries to drop off, whereas in confined places, foolish and futile thoughts of all kinds swarm like microbes and cloud and conceal the soul. Experto crede. It is only necessary to try this experiment in order to prove its truth. Another thing, which corresponds in some degree to living physically in the open air, is the living mentally and emotionally in the atmosphere of love. A large charity of mind which refuses absolutely to shut itself in little secluded places of prejudice, bigotry, and contempt for others, and which attains to a great and universal sympathy, helps most obviously to open the way to that region of calm and freedom of which we have spoken, while conversely all petty enmity, meanness, and spite conspire to imprison the soul and make its deliverance more difficult. It is not necessary to labor these points. As we said, the way to attain is to sincerely try to attain, to consistently practice attainment. Whoever does this will find that the way will open out by degrees, as of one emerging from a vast and gloomy forest, till out of darkness the path becomes clear. For whomsoever really tries, there is no failure. For every effort in that region is success, and every onward push, however small, and however little result it may show, is really a move forward, and one step nearer the light. End of section 33. Read by Sandra near Montreal, 2022. Section 34 of Pagan and Christian Creeds, Their Origin and Meaning. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Pagan and Christian Creeds, Their Origin and Meaning by Edward Carpenter. Appendix, Teaching of the Upanishads, Part 3. The Nature of the Self. The true nature of the self is a matter by no means easy to compass. We have all probably at some time or other attempted to fathom the deeps of personality and been baffled. Some people say they can quite distinctly remember a moment in early childhood, about the age of 3, though the exact period is of course only approximate, when self-consciousness, the awareness of being a little separate self, first dawned in the mind. It was generally at some moment of childish tension, alone perhaps in a garden or lost from the mother's protecting hand, that this happened, and it was the beginning of a whole range of new experience. Before some such period, there is in childhood, strictly speaking, no distinct self-consciousness. As Tennyson says in Memoriam 44, the baby new to earth and sky, what time his tender palm is pressed against the circle of the breast, hath never thought that this is I. It has consciousness truly, but no distinctive self-consciousness. It is this absence or deficiency which explains many things which at first seem obscure in the psychology of children and of animals. The baby, it has often been noticed, experiences little or no sense of fear. It does not know enough to be afraid. It has never formed any image of itself as of a thing which might be injured. It may shrink from actual pain or discomfort, but it does not look forward, which is the essence of fear, to pain in the future. Fear and self-consciousness are closely interlinked. Similarly, with animals, we often wonder how a horse or a cow can endure to stand out in a field all night, exposed to cold and rain, in the lethargic, patient way that they exhibit. It is not that they do not feel the discomfort, but it is that they do not envisage themselves as enduring this pain and suffering for all those coming hours. And as we know with ourselves that 9/10 of our miseries really consist in looking forward to future miseries, so we understand that the absence, or at any rate slight prevalence, of self-consciousness in animals enables them to endure forms of distress which would drive us mad. In time, then, the babe arrives at self-consciousness, and as one might expect, the growing boy or girl often becomes intensely aware of self. His or her self-consciousness is crude, no doubt, but it has very little misgiving. If the question of the nature of the self is propounded to the boy as a problem, he has no difficulty in solving it. He says, "I know well enough who I am. I am the boy with red hair that gave Jimmy Brown such a jolly good licking last Monday week." He knows well enough, or thinks he knows, who he is. And at a later age, although his definition may change and he may describe himself chiefly as a good cricketer or successful in certain examinations, his method is practically the same. He fixes his mind on a certain bundle of qualities and capacities which he is supposed to possess, and calls that bundle himself, and in a more elaborate way we most of us, I imagine, do the same. Presently, however, with more careful thought, we begin to see difficulties in this view. I see that directly I think of myself as a certain bundle of qualities, and for that matter it is of no account whether the qualities are good or bad, or in what sort of charming confusion they are mixed, I see at once that I am merely looking at a bundle of qualities, and that the real I, the self, is not that bundle, but is the being inspecting the same, something beyond and behind, as it were. So I now concentrate my thoughts upon that inner something in order to find out what it really is. I imagine perhaps an inner being of astral or ethereal nature, and possessing a new range of much finer and more subtle qualities than the body, a being inhabiting the body and perceiving through its senses, but quite capable of surviving the tenement in which it dwells, and I think of that as the self. But no sooner have I taken this step than I perceive that I am committing the same mistake as before. I am only contemplating a new image or picture, and I still remain beyond and behind that which I contemplate. No sooner do I turn my attention on the subjective being than it becomes objective, and the real subject retires into the background, and so on indefinitely. I'm baffled and unable to say positively what the self is. Meanwhile, there are people who look upon the foregoing speculations about an interior self as merely unpractical. Being perhaps of a more materialistic type of mind, they fix their attention on the body. Frankly, they try to define the self by the body and all that is connected therewith, that is, by the mental as well as corporeal qualities which exhibit themselves in that connection. And they say, quote, "At any rate, the self, whatever it may be, is in some way limited by the body. Each person studies the interest of his body and of the feelings, emotions, and mentality directly associated with it. And you cannot get beyond that. It isn't in human nature to do so. The self is limited by this corporeal phenomenon, and doubtless it perishes when the body perishes." End quote. But here again the conclusion, though specious at first, soon appears to be quite inadequate, for though it is possibly true that a man, if left alone in a Robinson Crusoe life on a desert island, might ultimately subside into a mere gratification of his corporeal needs and of those mental needs which were directly concerned with the body, yet we know that such a case would by no means be representative. On the contrary, we know that vast numbers of people spend their lives in considering other people, and often so far as to sacrifice their own bodily and mental comfort and well-being. The mother spends her life thinking almost day and night about her babe and the other children, spending all her thoughts and efforts on them. You may call her selfish if you will, but her selfishness clearly extends beyond her personal body and mind, and extends to the personalities of her children around her. Her body, if you insist on your definition, must be held to include the bodies of all her children. And again the husband, who is toiling for the support of the family. He is thinking and working and toiling and suffering for a self which includes his wife and children. Do you mean that the whole family is his body? Or a man belongs to some society, to a church, or to a social league of some kind, and his activities are largely ruled by the interests of this larger group? Or he sacrifices his life, as many have been doing of late, with extraordinary bravery and heroism for the sake of the nation to which he belongs. Must we say then that the whole nation is really a part of the man's body? Or again, he gives his life and goes to the stake for his religion. Whether his religion is right or wrong does not matter. The point is that in him which can carry him far beyond his local self and the ordinary instincts of his physical organism to dedicate his life and powers to a something of far wider circumference and scope. Thus, in the first of these two examples of a search for the nature of the self, we are led inwards from point to point into interior and even subtler regions of our being, and still in the end are baffled, while in the second we're carried outwards into an ever wider and wider circumference in our quest of the ego, and still feel that we failed to reach its ultimate nature. We're driven, in fact, by these two arguments to the conclusion that that which we're seeking is indeed something very vast, something far extending around, yet also buried deep in the hidden recesses of our minds. How far, how deep, we do not know. We can only say that as far as the indications point, the true self is profounder and more far-reaching than anything we have yet fathomed. In the ordinary commonplace life, we shrink to ordinary commonplace selves, but it is one of the blessings of great experiences, even though they're tragic or painful, that they throw us out into that enormously greater self to which we belong. Sometimes in moments of inspiration, of intense enthusiasm, of revelation, such as a man feels in the midst of a battle, in moments of love and dedication to another person, and in moments of religious ecstasy, an immense world is opened up to the astonished gaze of the inner man, who sees disclosed a self stretched far beyond anything he had ever imagined. We have all had experiences more or less of that kind. I have known quite a few people, and most of you have known some, who at some time, even if only once in their lives, have experienced such an extraordinary lifting of the veil, an opening out of the back of their minds, as it were, and have had such a vision of the world that they've never afterwards forgotten it. They've seen into the heart of creation, and have perceived their union with the rest of mankind. They have had glimpses of a strange immortality belonging to them, a glimpse of their belonging to a far greater being than they have ever imagined. Just once, and a man has never forgotten it, and even if it has not recurred, it has colored all the rest of his life. Now, this subject has been thought about since the beginning of the world, I was going to say, but it has been thought about since the beginnings of history. Some 3,000 years ago, certain groups of, I hardly like to call them philosophers, but let us say people who were meditating and thinking upon these problems, were in the habit of locating themselves in the forests of northern India, and schools arose there. In the case of each school, some teacher went into the woods and collected groups of disciples around him, who lived there in his company and listened to his words. Such schools were formed in very considerable numbers, and the doctrines of these teachers were gathered together, generally by their disciples, in notes, which notes were brought together into little pamphlets or tracts, forming the books which are called the Upanishads of the Indian sages. They contain some extraordinary words of wisdom, some of which I want to bring before you. The conclusions arrived at were not so much what we should call philosophy in the modern sense. They were not so much the result of the analysis of the mind and the following out of concatenations of strict argument, but they were flashes of intuition and experience. And all through the Upanishads you find these extraordinary flashes embedded in the midst of a great deal of what we should call a rather rubbishy kind of argument, and a good deal of merely conventional Brahmanical talk of those days. But the people who wrote and spoke thus had an intuition into the heart of things which I make bold to say very few people in modern life have. These Upanishads, however various their subject, practically agree on one point, in the definition of the self. They agree in saying that the self of each man is continuous with and in a sense identical with the self of the universe. Now that seems an extraordinary conclusion, and one which almost staggers the modern mind to conceive of, but that is the conclusion that is the thread which runs all through the Upanishads, the identity of the self of each individual with the self of every other individual throughout mankind, and even with the selves of the animals and other creatures. Those who have read the Khandogya Upanishad remember how, in that treatise, the father instructs his son, Svetakaitu, on this very subject, pointing him out in succession the objects of nature, and on each occasion exhorting him to realize his identity with the very essence of the object, tat tvam asi, that thou art. He calls Svetaketu's attention to a tree. What is the essence of the tree when they have rejected the external characteristics, the leaves, branches, etc., and agreed that the sap is the essence? Then the Father says, tat tvam asi, that thou art. He gives his son a crystal of salt and asks him, what is the essence of that? The son is puzzled. Clearly neither the form nor the transparent quality are essential. The Father says, put the crystal in water. Then when it is melted, he says, where is the crystal? The son replies, I do not know. Dip your finger in the bowl, says the Father, and taste. Then Svetaketu dips here and there, and everywhere there is a salt flavor. They agree that that is the essence of salt, and the Father says again, tat tvam asi. I am, of course, neither defending nor criticizing the scientific attitude here adopted. I'm only pointing out that this psychological identification of the observer with the object observed runs through the Upanishads, and is, I think, worthy of the deepest consideration. In the Bhagavad Gita, which is a later book, the author speaks of him whose soul is purified, whose self is the self of all creatures. A phrase like that challenges opposition. It is so bold, so sweeping, and so immense that we hesitate to give our adhesion to what it implies. But what does it mean, whose soul is purified? I believe that it means this, that with most of us our souls are anything but clean or purified. They are by no means transparent, so that all the time we are continually deceiving ourselves and making clouds between us and others. We are all the time grasping things from other people, and if not in words, are mentally boasting ourselves against others, trying to think of our own superiority to the rest of the people around us. Sometimes we try to run our neighbors down a little, just to show that they're not quite equal to our level. We try to snatch from others some things which belong to them, or take credit to ourselves for things to which we are not fairly entitled. But all the time we're acting so it is perfectly obvious that we're weaving veils between ourselves and others. You cannot have dealings with another person in a purely truthful way and be continually trying to cheat that person out of money or out of his good name and reputation. If you are doing that, however much in the background you may be doing it, you are not looking the person fairly in the face. There is a cloud between you all the time. So long as your soul is not purified from all these really absurd and ridiculous little desires and superiorities and self-satisfactions which make up so much of our lives, just so long as that happens, you do not and you cannot see the truth. But when it happens to a person, as it does happen in times of great and deep and bitter experience, when it happens that all these trumpery little objects of life are swept away, then occasionally with astonishment the soul sees that. It is also the soul of the others around. Even if it does not become aware of an absolute identity, it perceives that there is a deep relationship and communion between itself and others, and it comes to understand how it may really be true that to him whose soul is purified, the self is literally the self of all creatures. Ordinary men, and those who go on more intellectual and less intuitional lines, will say that these ideas are really contrary to human nature and to nature generally. Yet I think that those people who say this in the name of science are extremely unscientific, because a very superficial glance at nature reveals that the very same thing is taking place throughout nature. Consider the madrepores, corallines, or sponges. You find, for instance, that constantly the little self of the coralline or sponge is functioning at the end of a stem and casting forth its tentacles into the water to gain food and to breathe the air out of the water. That little animalcule there, which is living in that way, imagines no doubt that it is working all for itself, and yet it is united down the stem at whose extremity it stands, with the life of the whole madrepore or sponge to which it belongs. There is the common life of the whole, and the individual life of each, and while the little creature at the end of the stem is thinking, if it is conscious at all, that its whole energies are absorbed in its own maintenance, it really is feeding the common life through the stem to which it belongs, and in its turn it is being fed by that common life. You have only to look at an ordinary tree to see the same thing going on. Each little leaf on a tree may very naturally have sufficient consciousness to believe that it is an entirely separate being maintaining itself in the sunlight and the air, withering away and dying when the winter comes on. And there is an end of it. It probably does not realize that all the time it is being supported by the sap which flows from the trunk of the tree, and that in its turn it is feeding the tree too, that its self is the self of the whole tree. If the leaf could really understand itself, it would see that itself was deeply, intimately connected, practically one with the life of the whole tree. Therefore I say that this Indian view is not unscientific. On the contrary, I am sure that it is thoroughly scientific. Let us take another passage out of the Svetasvatara Upanishad, which, speaking of the self, says, "He is the one God, hidden in all creatures, all-pervading, the self within all, watching over all works, shadowing all creatures, the witness, the perceiver, the only one, free from qualities." And now we can return to the point where we left the argument at the beginning of this discourse. We said, you remember, that the self is certainly no mere bundle of qualities, that the very nature of the mind forbids us thinking that. For however fine and subtle any quality or group of qualities may be, we are irresistibly compelled by the nature of the mind itself to look for the self, not in any quality or qualities, but in the being that perceives those qualities. The passage I have just quoted says that being is, quote, "the one God, hidden in all creatures, all-pervading, the self within all, the witness, the perceiver, the only one, free from qualities." End quote. And the more you think about it, the clearer I think you will see that this passage is correct, that there can be only one witness, one perceiver, and that is the one God, hidden in all creatures, Sarva Sakshi, the universal witness. Have you ever had that curious feeling, not uncommon, especially in moments of vivid experience and emotion, that there was at the back of your mind a witness, watching everything that was going on, yet too deep for your ordinary thought to grasp? Has it not occurred to you in a moment, say, of great danger, when the mind was agitated to the last degree by fears and anxieties, suddenly to become perfectly calm and collected, to realize that nothing can harm you, that you're identified with some great and universal being lifted far over this mortal world and unaffected by its storms? Is it not obvious that the real self must be something of this nature, a being perceiving all, but itself remaining unperceived? For indeed, if it were perceived, it would fall under the head of some definable quality, and so, becoming the object of thought, would cease to be the subject, would cease to be the self. The witness is and must be free from qualities, for since it is capable of perceiving all qualities, it must obviously not be itself imprisoned or tied in any quality. It must either be entirely without quality, or, if it have the potentiality of quality in it, it must have the potentiality of every quality. But in either case it cannot be in bondage to any quality, and in either case it would appear that there can be only one such ultimate witness in the universe. For if there were two or more such witnesses, then we should be compelled to suppose them distinguished from one another by something, and that something could only be a difference of qualities, which would be contrary to our conclusion that such a witness cannot be in bondage to any quality. There is then, I take it, as the text in question says, only one witness, one self, throughout the universe. It is hidden in all living things, men and animals and plants. It pervades all creation. In everything that has consciousness, it is the self. It watches over all operations. It overshadows all creatures. It moves in the depths of our hearts, the perceiver, the only being that is cognizant of all and yet free from all. Once you really appropriate this truth and assimilate it in the depths of your mind, a vast change you can easily imagine will take place within you. The whole world will be transformed, and every thought and act of which you are capable will take on a different color and complexion. Indeed, the revolution will be so vast that it would be quite impossible for me within the limits of this discourse to describe it. I will, however, occupy the rest of my time in dealing with some points and conclusions, and some mental changes which will flow perfectly naturally from this axiomatic change taking place at the very root of life. Free from qualities. We generally pride ourselves a little on our qualities. Some of us think a great deal of our good qualities, and some of us are rather ashamed of our bad ones. I would say, do not trouble very much about all that. What good qualities you have, well, you may be quite sure they do not really amount to much, and what bad qualities you may be sure that they are not very important. Do not make too much fuss about either, do you see? The thing is that you yourself, are not any of your qualities. You are the being that perceives them. The thing to see to is that they should not confuse you, bamboozle you, and hide you from the knowledge of yourself. That they should not be erected into a screen to hide you from others or the others from you. If you cease from running after qualities, then after a little time your soul will become purified, and you will know that your true self is the self of all creatures. And when you can feel that, you will know that the other things do not much matter. Sometimes people are so awfully good that their very goodness hides them from other people. They really cannot be on a level with others, and they feel that the others are far below them. Consequently, their selves are blinded or hidden by their goodness. It is a sad end to come to, and sometimes it happens that very bad people, just because they're so bad, do not erect any screens or veils between themselves and others. Indeed, they are only too glad if others will recognize them, or if they may be allowed to recognize others. And so, after all, they come nearer the truth than the very good people. The self is free from qualities. That thing which is so deep, which belongs to all, it either, as I've said already, has all qualities or it has none. You, to whom I'm speaking now, your qualities, good and bad, are all mine. I'm perfectly willing to accept them. They are all right enough and in place, if one can only find the places for them. But I know that in most cases they have got so confused and mixed up that they cause great conflict and pain in the souls that harbor them. If you attain to knowing yourself to be other than and separate from the qualities, then you will pass below and beyond them all. You will be able to accept all your qualities and harmonize them, and your soul will be at peace. You will be free from the domination of qualities then, because you will know that among all the multitudes of them, there are none of any importance. If you should happen some day to reach that state of mind in connection with which this revelation comes, then you will find the experience a most extraordinary one. You will become conscious that there is no barrier in your path, that the way is open in all directions, that all men and women belong to you, are part of you. You will feel that there is a great, open, immense world around, which you had never suspected before, which belongs to you, and the riches of which are all yours, waiting for you. It may, of course, take centuries and thousands of years to realize this thoroughly, but there it is. You are just at the threshold, peeping in at the door. What did Shakespeare say? To thine own self be true, and it must follow as the night the day, thou canst not then be false to any man. What a profound bit of philosophy in 3 lines. I doubt if anywhere the basis of all human life has been expressed more perfectly and tersely. One of the Upanishads, the Maitrayana Brahmana, says, quote, the happiness belonging to a mind which, through deep inwardness or understanding, has been washed clean and has entered into the self, is a thing beyond the power of words to describe. It can only be perceived by an inner faculty. End quote. Observe the conviction, the intensity with which this joy, this happiness is described, which comes to those whose minds have been washed clean from all the silly trumpery sediment of self-thought, and have become transparent so that the great universal being residing there in the depths can be perceived. What sorrow indeed, what grief can come to such a one who has seen this vision. It is truly a thing beyond the power of words to describe. It can only be perceived, and that by an inner faculty. The external apparatus of thought is of no use. Argument is of no use. But experience and direct perception are possible, and probably all the experiences of life and of mankind through the ages are gradually deepening our powers of perception to that point where the vision will at last rise upon the inward eye. Note: the word inwardness in the Max Muller translation is meditation, but that is, I think, a somewhat misleading word. It suggests to most people the turning inward of the thinking faculty to grope and delve in the interior of the mind. This is just what should not be done. Meditation, in the proper sense, should mean the inward deepening of feeling and consciousness till the region of the universal self is reached, but thought should not interfere there. That should be turned on outward things to mold them into expression of the inner consciousness. End of note. Another text from the Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad, which I've already quoted in the paper on rest, says, quote, "If a man worship the self only as his true state, his work cannot fail, for whatever he desires, that he obtains from the self." End quote. Is that not magnificent? If you truly realize your identity and union with the great self who inspires and informs the world, then obviously whatever you desire, the great self will desire, and the whole world will conspire to bring it to you. Quote, "He maketh the winds his angels, and the flaming fires his ministers." End quote. I need not say that I'm not asking you to try and identify yourself with the great self universal in order to get riches, opulence, and other things of that kind which you desire, because in that quest you will probably not succeed. The great self is not such a fool as to be taken in that way. It may be true, and it is true, that if you seek first the kingdom of heaven, all these things shall be added unto you, but you must seek it first, not second. Here is a passage from Towards Democracy. Quote, "As space spreads everywhere, and all things move and change within it, but it moves not, nor changes. So I am the space within the soul, of which the space without is but the similitude and mental image. Comest thou to inhabit me, thou hast the entrance to all life. Death shall no longer divide thee from whom thou lovest. I am the sun that shines upon all creatures from within. Gazest thou upon me, thou shalt be filled with joy eternal." End quote. Yes, this great sun is there, always shining, but most of the time it's hidden from us by the clouds of which I've spoken, and we fail to see it. We complain of being out in the cold, and in the cold for the time being, no doubt we are, but our return to the warmth and the light has now become possible. Thus, at last, the ego, the mortal, immortal self, disclosed at first in darkness and fear and ignorance in the growing babe, finds its true identity. For a long period it is baffled in trying to understand what it is. It goes through a vast experience. It is tormented by the sense of separation and alienation from other people, and persecution by all the great powers and forces of the universe. And it is pursued by a sense of its own doom. Its doom truly is irrevocable. The hour of fulfillment approaches, the veil lifts, and the soul beholds at last its own true being. We are accustomed to think of the external world around us as a nasty, tiresome old thing, of which all we can say for certain is that it works by a law of cussedness, so that whichever way we want to go, that way always seems barred, and we only bump against blind walls without making any progress. But that uncomfortable state of affairs arises from ourselves. Once we've passed a certain barrier which at present looks so frowning and impossible, but which fades into nothing immediately we've passed it, once we've found the open secret of identity, then the way is indeed open in every direction. The world in which we live, the world into which we are tumbled as children at the first onset of self-consciousness, denies this great fact of unity. It is a world in which the principle of separation rules. Instead of a common life and union with each other, The contrary principle, especially in the later civilizations, has been the one recognized, and to such an extent that always there prevails the obsession of separation and the conviction that each person is an isolated unit. The whole of our modern society has been founded on this delusive idea, which is false. You go into the markets and every man's hand is against the others. That is the ruling principle. You go into the law courts where justice is, or should be, administered, and you find that the principle which denies unity is the one that prevails. The criminal whose actions have really been determined by the society around him is cast out, disacknowledged, and condemned to further isolation in a prison cell. Property, again, is the principle which rules and determines our modern civilization, namely that which is proper to or can be appropriated by each person as against the others. In the moral world, the doom of separation comes to us in the shape of the sense of sin. For sin is separation. Sin is actually, and that is its only real meaning, the separation from others and the non-acknowledgement of unity. And so it has come about that during all this civilization period the sense of sin has ruled and ranged to such an extraordinary degree. Society has been built on a false base, not true to fact or life, and has had a dim, uneasy consciousness of its falseness. Meanwhile, at the heart of it all, and within all the frantic external strife and warfare, there is all the time this real great life brooding. The kingdom of heaven, as we said before, is still within. The word democracy indicates something of the kind, the rule of the demos, that is, of the common life. The coming of that will transform not only our markets and our law courts and our sense of property and other institutions into something really great and glorious instead of the dismal masses of rubbish which they at present are, but it will transform our sense of morality. Our morality at present consists in the idea of self-goodness, one of the most pernicious and disgusting ideas which has ever infested the human brain. If anyone should follow and assimilate what I've just said about the true nature of the self, he will realize that it will never again be possible for him to congratulate himself on his own goodness or morality or superiority. For the moment he does so, he will separate himself from the universal life and proclaim the sin of his own separation. I agree that this conclusion is for some people a most sad and disheartening one, but it cannot be helped. A man may truly be good and moral in some real sense, but only on the condition that he is not aware of it. He can only be good when not thinking about the matter. To be conscious of one's own goodness is already to have fallen. We began by thinking of the self as just a little local self. Then we extended it to the family, the cause, the nation, ever to a larger and vaster being. At last there comes a time when we recognize, or see that we shall have to recognize, an inner equality between ourselves and all others. Not, of course, an external equality, for that would be absurd and impossible, but an inner and profound and universal equality. And so we come again to the mystic root conception of democracy. And now it will be said, quote, "But after all this talk you've not defined the self, or given us any intellectual outline of what you mean by the word." End quote. No, and I do not intend to. If I could by any sort of copybook definition describe and show the boundaries of myself, I should obviously lose all interest in the subject. Nothing more dull could be imagined. I may be able to define and describe fairly exhaustively this ink pot on the table, but for you or for me to give the limits and boundaries of ourselves is, I'm glad to say, impossible. That does not, however, mean that we cannot feel and be conscious of ourselves and of our relations to other selves and to the great whole. On the contrary, I think it's clear that the more vividly we feel our organic unity with the whole, the less shall we be able to separate off the local self and enclose it within any definition. I take it that we can and do become ever more vividly conscious of our true self, but that the mental statement of it always does and probably always will lie beyond us. All life and all our action and experience consist in the gradual manifestation of that which is within us, of our inner being. In that sense, and reading its handwriting on the outer world, We come to know the soul's true nature more and more intimately. We enter into the mind of that great artist who beholds himself in his own creation. End of section 34, read by Sandra in Nova Scotia, 2022. End of Pagan and Christian Creeds, Their Origin and Meaning by Edward Carpenter.